Chapter 1. The moon hung low and heavy, casting silver veins through the branches that clawed at the night sky. I felt the shift coming long before it took hold. It started in the bones, cold, sharp edges slicing beneath my skin like shards of glass. I gritted my teeth against it, swallowing back the growl that threatened to slip free. Luka was somewhere behind me, his footfalls nearly silent. But I felt him. I always felt him. His presence brushed against the edges of my awareness, steady and sure, like a tether pulling me back when the change coiled too tightly inside me. I crouched low behind a fallen tree, breath misting in the cold air, my senses stretched outward, picking apart the night. The forest sang with life, owls drifting through the canopy, mice scurrying beneath the underbrush. But it was the Rogeses I hunted. He was close, too close, for gratefulness in his voice, which made me smile. I licked the taste of him off the wind. Wolf, but wrong, too wild. Rogues were sloppy with their scent, their edges fraying until it bled into everything around them. This one reeked of fear, hunger, and something else. Desperation. I stepped forward, slow and careful, letting the damp leaves soak into the soles of my boots. My pulse quickened, every nerve in me singing with the need to run him down. I didn't need to hunt, Luka would have handled it, but tonight the itch beneath my skin was unbearable. I couldn't sit by the fire and pretend I didn't feel the pull. "You're too far ahead," Luka's voice brushed through the bond between us, soft but edged, always edged. "I can handle it," I whispered back. The rogue shifted behind a copse of trees. I heard the snap of his joints, the slow scrape of his claws against bark as he moved deeper into the woods. He was circling, trying to catch my scent. Ugh. I bared my teeth, letting the hybrid edge of me bleed through. Luka didn't understand the fire burning inside me. Not really. How could he? He was born to this, built from it. I was stitched together from two worlds that didn't belong to each other, and tonight they were unraveling. I moved before I thought, one step, then two, and he saw me. The rogue whiffed his head toward me, eyes burning gold as the shift took him fully. His lips peeled back in a snarl, and the trees seemed to close in tighter, watching. My pulse thrummed against my ribs, and the hunger roared louder than it should have. He lunched. I didn't wait. I shifted before his claws found me, skin peeling back, bones snapping into something stronger, something that didn't belong to either shifter or wolf, something caught in between. The rogue crashed into me, teeth gnashing. I caught his muzzle in my hands and twisted. His neck popped. He went still. I stood over him, chest heaving. His body twitched once beneath me, steam rising in the cold air. Blood seeped into the moss beneath his slack jaws. Too easy. I wiped the back of my hand across my mouth, tasting the metallic tang that wasn't mine. The shift lingered beneath my skin, refusing to fade. By the way, footsteps, Luka's scent brushed over me just as he appeared at the edge of the clearing. His gaze flicked to the body at my feet, then to me. His brows drew together, the line between them deepening. "I told you to wait," he said, voice quiet. "I told you to wait." "You were too far," I said, the growl still rasping against my throat. Richard Ducker, director of the Cold Pen scandal, his eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, but I didn't miss the way his hand hovered near the knife strapped to his thigh. I hated the way that small movement made something inside me twist. I had it under control, I said. You're bleeding, he said. I glanced down. Claw marks traced the length of my shoulder. I hadn't even felt them. They were already healing, knitting together beneath the shifting heat that hadn't fully left my body. It's nothing, I said. Luka stepped closer, eyes fixed on mine, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give him. What happened? I met his gaze, holding it longer than I should have. I don't know. And that was the truth. I'd hunted rogues before, but tonight felt different. The shift had come too fast, the hunger too sharp. Luka's eyes darkened, but he didn't say anything else. Instead, he crouched next to the rogue, inspecting the broken body with practiced ease. Third one this month, he muttered. They're getting bolder. They're desperate, he corrected. I glanced at the scars lining his forearms. Old wounds. Luka had spent most of his life keeping rogues in line, or putting them down when the line broke. But the edges of his territory were bleeding faster than he could stitch them shut, and my eyes could hear Candy as she hung. This one was close to the cabin, I said. His jaw tightened. Too close. He stood and nudged the body with his boot. I'll take care of it. I can help. No, Luka said too fast. Go back to the cabin, clean up. It wasn't a request. I bristled, but I turned toward the path leading home. Luka didn't trust me to bury the body. I could feel it, like an itch beneath the surface of his skin. When it was Hazel, I straightened my shoulders, ready to make his way. I left without another word. The cabin lights flickered through the trees by the time I reached the clearing. Smoke curled from the chimney, the faintest hum of warmth radiating against the cold forest air. I hesitated at the door, staring at the faint streaks of blood still crusting beneath my nails. The shift had taken longer than it should have to fade. Luka would brush it off, say I'd pushed too hard, let my instincts get the better of me. But that wasn't it. I felt it in the way the shift lingered at the edges of my senses, claws still half buried beneath my skin. I wasn't losing control. I had already started to lose it. I opened the door and stepped inside. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the cabin felt colder than usual. I stood at the sink, scrubbing blood from beneath my fingernails. No matter how many times I washed them, the stain lingered. The phantom of the rogue's lifeless eyes staring up at me. Behind me, Luka's quiet footsteps crossed the wooden floor. I didn't turn. His presence filled the room, heavy with the weight of whatever thoughts he was keeping to himself. You're overthinking it, Luka said finally. I am seceded. I glanced at him through the reflection in the window. His arms were crossed over his broad chest, his dark hair damp from the snow outside. Am I? I countered, my voice sharper than I intended. That rogue was too close to the cabin. And my shift. You were in control, he interrupted, stepping closer. I tensed as his hand brushed my shoulder. For now, I murmured, setting the towel down. I met his gaze, searching for the reassurance I needed but didn't quite trust. Luka was good at pretending, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Before either of us could say more, a sharp knock rattled the door. Luka's body stiffened immediately. His hand moved instinctively to the knife strapped to his hip. Expecting company? I asked. His eyes never left the door. No. I moved quietly to the side, grabbing the dagger I kept hidden beneath the table. Luka's scent shifted, tense, sharp. Whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't a friendly neighbor. The knock came again, harder this time. Luka opened the door. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy cloak dusted with snow. His face was shadowed beneath the hood, but I recognized him immediately. Marcus. His scent flooded the cabin, wild, thick with dominance that curled in the air like smoke. Luka's entire body went rigid. His skin pricked. "You're a long way from your territory," Luka said coldly. Marcus lowered his hood, revealing sharp features and piercing amber eyes. He smirked, but the expression never reached his eyes. "I could say the same about you," Marcus replied. His gaze flicked past Luka to me. His stare lingered on the faint scar along my collarbone, the mark Luka left when he bit me. I clenched my jaw, holding his gaze without flinching. "What do you want, Marcus?" Luka growled. Marcus leaned casually against the door frame, but there was nothing relaxed about him. "The council's curious," Marcus said, his tone light but laced with warning. "Rumors are spreading about a certain hybrid lurking near the borders." Luka stepped between us, his shoulders squared. "She's none of their concern." Marcus's gaze flickered with amusement. "Everything that threatens our kind is the council's concern." I tightened my grip on the dagger behind my back. "I'm not a threat," I said, stepping forward. Luka shot me a warning glance, but I ignored it. "I'll come back." Marcus's smirk widened. "Funny. That's exactly what the last hybrid said before she tore through half a pack during the full moon." I didn't blink. "I'm not her." Marcus studied me for a long moment. "No," he said softly, "but you'll be worse." The room fell silent. Luka's grip on the door tightened until his knuckles turned white. "You've delivered your message," Luka said through clenched teeth. "Now leave." Marcus's gaze lingered on me for another heartbeat before he stepped back into the snow. "Consider this a courtesy visit," Marcus called over his shoulder as he walked away. "The next time I come, it won't be alone." Luka slammed the door behind him, the echo ringing through the cabin like a gunshot. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of Marcus's words settle into my bones. "You shouldn't have answered him," Luka muttered. I turned to face him. "I'm not going to hide every time someone comes knocking, Luka." "You should." His voice was low, dangerous. I stepped closer, the firelight casting flickering shadows between us. "If the council wants me, hiding won't stop them." Luka's eyes darkened, and for a moment I saw the wolf lurking just beneath the surface. "They'll have to go through me first," he said. His words should have comforted me. They didn't, because I knew Marcus, and if he returned, Luka wouldn't be enough to stop him. Then delved into my DMs and began to go through my files. I had a lot of information. Chapter 2, The Weight of the Blood. The snow had started falling by the time I reached the edge of the woods. Fat flakes drifted lazily through the dark, settling on my hair and shoulders, as if the night itself was trying to bury me. Luka trailed a few steps behind, quiet but present, like a shadow that refused to leave. I wished he would. The rogue's blood still lingered beneath my nails. No matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't shake the coppery taste from my mouth or the faint tremble in my hands. The shift had come too easily. Truth asked. Luka hadn't said much since we left the clearing, but I felt his eyes burning into the back of my head. He'd seen it. The way my body twisted too far, the way I held the rogue down longer than necessary. He thought I was losing control. Maybe he was right. I stopped at the cabin's door. glancing at the thick tree line that curled around the property like a fortress. The wolves had scattered, but I knew better than to think they were gone for good. Marcus didn't back down. Drugless rose, brushing off dust and dirt from himself and me. Neither did I. I pushed open the door. Warmth greeted me, along with the faint scent of burning cedar. The fire Luka had built earlier was dying, crackling softly in the hearth. I was halfway across the room when I felt it, a shift in the air, subtle but wrong. Someone else was here. Luka must have felt it too. His hand brushed against my lower back, urging me behind him as he stepped forward. Human, Luka growled. You're supposed to be dead. A figure sat in the corner, half shrouded by shadow, an old wolf wrapped in worn furs. His silver hair hung long over his shoulders, tangled with beads and feathers that marked him as one of the elders, the last of a dying breed. Ayam. The name settled in my chest like ice. I thought I might find you two lurking out here, Eamon rasped, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding against each other. His gaze flicked toward me, lingering on the scar Luka's bite had left along my collarbone. I see the infection hasn't taken her fully. Not yet, anyway. My shoulders tensed. I'm handling it. Eamon laughed, but there was no warmth in it. You're not handling anything, girl. The blood's already stirring. Luka shifted slightly, his body angled protectively between me and the old wolf. What do you want? Luka asked coldly. Eamon rose from the chair with surprising ease, his long coat sweeping the floor. Despite his age, there was strength beneath the layers of weariness, a sharpness that hadn't dulled with time. I came to deliver a warning, Eamon said, his pale eyes locking onto mine. There's a prophecy, one the council buried long ago. A hybrid born of wolf and shifter blood, destined to either unite the clans or destroy them. I swallowed hard, heart hammering against my ribs. So, and you think that's me? Eamon's stare didn't waver. I know it is. Luka's jaw tightened. Prophecies are nothing but stories to scare pups into behaving. Maybe. Eamon stepped closer, his gaze dropping to the faint glow that still lingered around the edges of my eyes. But the council believes it. Marcus does too. Why else would he send his wolves sniffing around here? I clenched my fists, nails biting into the flesh of my palms. So what am I supposed to do? Hide until they come for me? No. Eamon's expression softened, but only slightly. You can't run from this. The infection isn't just changing you. It's awakening something older, stronger. If you don't control it, it will control you. Luka growled low in his throat. She's not your problem, old man. She's mine. She's my friend. Eamon's gaze slid back to Luka, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Is no one's possession, Luka. You do well to remember that. Luka didn't answer. Eamon turned back to me, stepping close enough that I could see the network of scars along his neck. Marks from battles long before my time. Be careful who you trust, Aria. Not all wolves want to see you survive this. The door creaked open, and in a blink, Eamon was gone, disappearing into the snow like he'd never been there at all. Luka cursed under his breath, raking a hand through his hair. Don't listen to him, Luka said, his voice edged with frustration. He's trying to get inside your head. I sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the fading embers in the hearth. What if he's right? I asked quietly. Luka crossed the room in 2 strides, crouching in front of me. His hands settled lightly on my knees, grounding me with his touch. Falling in the morning. It's not time to make a settlement. You don't know that. Luka's gaze searched mine, the faint gold in his irises flickering dangerously. I know you, and I know you're stronger than whatever's inside you. The words should have comforted me. They didn't, because deep down, I wasn't sure he believed them either. The door shut behind Emon with a hollow thud, leaving Luka and me alone in the cabin. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling fire, its glow stretching shadows long across the floor. Luka hadn't moved from the doorway. His arms hung loose at his sides, but the tension rippling through his muscles betrayed him. His eyes flickered, molten gold fading to brown, as he let the shift simmer beneath his skin. He wasn't looking at me. He was still staring at the door. You don't trust him, I said, breaking the silence. Luka's gaze snapped to me. His jaw tightened. I trust him. About as much as I trust Marcus. He shrugged. That was saying something. I crossed the room and sank onto the edge of the bed, feeling the exhaustion seep into my bones. The shift, the fight, and whatever the hell was stirring in my blood left me raw. But I wasn't ready to let this go. What if he's right? I asked, keeping my voice low. About the prophecy? God, she asked, her voice lower. Luka's eyes darkened. He moved closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Prophecies are stories, Aria. Nothing more. End quote. I glanced at the faint glow of silver circling the edges of my vision. Stories don't leave marks. Luka's hand brushed against my shoulder, thumb grazing the scar he left there when he bit me. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down my spine, but it wasn't enough to erase the weight settling in my chest. I could feel it, something shifting inside me. It wasn't just the infection anymore. Luka's grip tightened slightly. Whatever he told you, forget it. Marcus will use anything to divide us. You think this prophecy is some secret? The council's known for years. They've been waiting for someone like you to show up, and they'll twist this to justify putting you down. His words should have reassured me. They didn't. I met his gaze, refusing to let the uncertainty show. You think Marcus needs an excuse to come after me? Luka's expression hardened. No. But it makes things easier for him if the council's already sharpening their knives. Saya was restored. I leaned into his touch just enough to steady myself, even as frustration burned low in my gut. Look, you can't protect me from all of them, Luka. His eyes flickered, something unreadable passing through them. I can try. I hated how much I wanted to believe that. Before I could say anything else, Luka stepped back, running a hand through his dark hair. The firelight caught the scars along his ribs, twisting shadows across his skin. You should rest, he said, his voice rougher than before. Amon's gone, but Marcus won't be far behind. I exhaled slowly, feeling the ache settle deep in my bones. Luka was right. Tonight had drained me. But as I pulled the blanket over my shoulders, I watched him carefully. Luka stood by the window, eyes scanning the tree line outside like he expected Marcus to materialize from the shadows. His shoulders never relaxed. Neither did mine. The next morning the snow had stopped. The world outside the cabin stretched cold and silent beneath the pale light of dawn. Luka had already disappeared, probably tracking Marcus's scent. I stepped onto the porch, wrapping Luka's oversized jacket tighter around me. The cold bit at my skin, but it wasn't enough to chase away the lingering heat, curling beneath the surface. The infection stirred, subtle but constant. I could feel it pulsing in my veins, the faintest hum beneath the surface of my skin. You shouldn't be out here alone. I stiffened, turning toward the voice. Marcus stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed over his broad chest. Snow clung to his boots and the hem of his coat, but his gaze burned like wildfire as it settled on me. I didn't move. "Luka's not here," I said evenly. Ursa's smirk didn't falter. "I know." I gripped the edge of the railing, letting the rough wood bite into my palms. "What do you want, Marcus?" His eyes lingered on me, but there was no warmth behind them. "You've been busy," he said, his tone almost casual. "Eamon paid you a visit, didn't he?" I didn't answer. Marcus's smirk faded. "You should be careful who you let into your cabin, Aria. The wrong company could get you killed." "I can handle Eamon," I snapped. Marcus's gaze sharpened. "Can you handle me?" The air between us shifted. I stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between us until only a few feet remained. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't move. A feeling of enragement. "If you're here to threaten me, Marcus," I said quietly, "you should know by now. I don't scare easy." His lips curled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not here to threaten you, Aria." I didn't believe that for a second. Marcus stepped closer, too close, and I forced myself to hold his gaze. "I'm here to offer you protection," Marcus said, voice lowering. "You're not just some rogue shifter anymore. You're valuable. To the council, to me, to you," he told me without looking right into my eyes. I could hear the hidden implication buried beneath the words. "Learned to integrate." I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. "I don't need your protection." Marcus's eyes flickered with amusement, but something colder lurked beneath it. "Luka can't protect you from what's coming," Marcus said. "But I can. The council listens to me, Aria, and when the time comes, I'll make sure they see your worth if you're standing beside me." The offer tasted like poison. I stepped back, shaking my head. I'd rather take my chances with Luka. Marcus's gaze darkened, and for a brief second, I saw the wolf lurking just beneath his skin. "Don't mistake Luka's loyalty for strength," Marcus warned. "When the council comes, he'll have to choose his pack or you." Even in his professional, superior office and seeming invincible abilities, his words lingered long after he disappeared into the woods. When Luka returned hours later, I didn't tell him Marcus had come. Wasn't sure why. Chapter 3. The Ghost We Carry. The wind carried the sharp bite of winter as we crossed into the old train yard. Rusted freight cars sat in long forgotten lines, their metal bellies hollow and cold under the pale moonlight. I didn't know why Luka brought me here. This place wasn't marked on any maps. My daily rounds of the festival had swallowed up the darkness of the garden. "You sure no one's lurking around?" I asked, stepping over broken tracks, half buried beneath frost. My voice echoed faintly. Luka didn't answer. He kept walking, boots crunching on brittle grass, as if the silence between us wasn't suffocating. That was Luka for you. Silent until it killed him. But I knew better. Something about this place had pulled him in, something old. And Luka didn't dwell on old things, unless they had teeth. I trailed behind him, letting the night settle into my bones. The infection hummed beneath my skin, a constant reminder that I wasn't just shifter anymore. Luka's bite had made sure of that. But in the end, the resilience of the shifter. "Hey, hey!" I said, catching up. "You gonna tell me why we're wandering around an abandoned train yard in the middle of nowhere? Or do I just get to enjoy the ambiance?" His head tilted slightly, but he didn't stop. "I used to run through here when I was younger." That wasn't an answer. "Luka." He sighed. "It's safe." I narrowed my eyes. Safe doesn't mean friendly, she said. He finally stopped near an old loading dock, turning to face me. The moon caught the hard lines of his face, shadows sinking deep beneath his eyes. That's what he looked like. I wanted you away from the cabin, he said, voice low, away from the pack. No. There it was. I crossed my arms, planting myself firmly in front of him. Why? Luka shifted, his weight falling into one leg like he was deciding how much to say. His gaze flicked past me to the silent freight cars, lingering longer than it should have. I followed his stare. The train cars looked the same as when we arrived. Empty, silent, forgotten. But there was something in the way Luka's jaw tightened, something that screamed he wasn't just seeing rust and steel. Luka! I stepped closer. What happened here? He dragged a hand down his face. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to tell me. Then, without looking at me, he said, "My pack hunted a hybrid here once." The words dropped like a hammer between us. My heart thumped hard against my ribs. I forced my arms to stay at my sides when all I wanted to do was cross them like armor. He said. I swallowed. How? His eyes finally met mine. I wasn't fast enough. The cold that had been nipping at my skin sank deeper. She wasn't dangerous, Luka continued, his voice tight. But my alpha decided that didn't matter. She wasn't one of us, and that was enough. A low growl worked its way up my throat before I could stop it. Luka's pack, the one that banished him, had hunted hybrids, like me. My muscles tensed. I should have walked away, should have left him standing there in the cold, haunted by whatever ghosts he dragged with him. But instead, I went to stare at Raven's hand, but I didn't. Instead, I said, "You didn't stop them." His face hardened. "Oh, I tried." Silence stretched between us, sharp and heavy. She trusted me, Luka admitted, the weight in his voice catching me off guard. I told her I could protect her, that I'd keep her safe. And his mouth pressed into a thin line. I couldn't. I let the words sink in. They felt heavier than the winter air. Not her, Luka, I said quietly. He stepped closer, his presence warming the air between us despite the cold. I know. His gaze lingered on me, intense and unreadable. But you're still a target, and I won't let Marcus or anyone else touch you. I felt the heat of his words settle somewhere deeper than I wanted to admit. But trust wasn't something I handed out like scraps. Not anymore. You're asking me to believe you? I said. I'm asking you to let me prove it. My pulse throbbed hard beneath my skin. Before I could respond, Luka's eyes flashed gold and his head snapped toward the shadows between the freight cars. What is it? I whispered, instincts flaring. Luka's body shifted, muscles coiling beneath his jacket. His lips pulled back, bearing the faintest trace of sharp canines. We're not alone. I turned, and the wind shifted. That's when I caught it. Marcus's scent. I didn't see him at first, but I heard the faint rustle of footsteps. Luka's hand brushed against my arm, guiding me behind him as Marcus emerged from the shadows with two other wolves flanking his sides. His smile was slow, deliberate. Out for a stroll, Luka? Luka's growl rumbled low in his chest. You're far from your territory, Marcus. Marcus's eyes slid to me, the same way a predator watches prey. I heard rumors, Marcus said, his gaze lingering on the scar along my collarbone, about a little hybrid tucked away in your den. Luka shifted, partially blocking me from Marcus's view. She's not your concern. Hello, but she is. Marcus stepped forward, his wolves circling behind him. You know the rules. Hybrids are dangerous, unpredictable. His smile sharpened. Or did you forget the last one you tried to save? Luka lunged. He hit Marcus hard, their bodies slamming into the side of a rusted train car with a sharp, metallic screech. The two wolves charged me, but I was already shifting. Pain lanced through me as my form twisted, jaguar claws cutting through the cold air. I met the first wolf head on, slamming him into the ground as Luka tangled with Marcus. Teeth snapped too close to my neck, but I rolled, raking claws across his flank. He yelped and scrambled away, limping back toward the shadows. The second wolf hesitated, but I bared my fangs, daring him to come closer. Luka's growl echoed loud behind me as Marcus finally retreated, his eyes flashing with something I didn't like. What's so matter now? This isn't over, Marcus snarled, blood dripping from his lip. Luka's stance didn't waver. It was over before you started. Marcus faded into the night, leaving Luka and me standing in the aftermath, breathless and bruised. Luka's eyes found mine, the wild gleam in them softening. Still don't trust me? He asked. I wiped blood from my jaw, heart hammering in my chest. No, I said. But I'm starting to. The night settled uneasily around us as Marcus and his wolves disappeared into the dark. But their presence lingered like smoke after a fire, thick, cloying, impossible to shake. Luka's breathing slowed, but his stance didn't relax. His eyes remained fixed on the shadows between the freight cars, as if Marcus might double back for another round. He'll regroup, Luka muttered, wiping blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. He's not the type to walk away without getting what he came for. I flexed my fingers, willing the last of the shift to fade. My body still vibrated with leftover adrenaline, muscles aching from the fight. The rogue I'd taken down lay motionless in the snow, but the faint taste of his blood hadn't left my tongue. You're bleeding, I said, noting the thin line of crimson trickling down Luka's arm, staining the fabric of his jacket. On your own timeline. It's nothing. I stepped closer, brushing his hand aside. His jaw tensed, but he didn't pull away. The gash was deeper than he let on, claw marks cutting across his bicep in uneven streaks. Finalize your plan and make love to your partner by drawing shapes in the dark. Could have fooled me, I said. His eyes flicked toward mine, shadows pooling in their depth. You worry too much. You get hurt too much. The tension between us tightened, thick as the snow drifting lazily from the sky. I didn't like seeing Luka bleed. Not because I thought he couldn't handle it, but because it meant Marcus was escalating. You need stitches, I said, trying to ignore the way my stomach twisted at the sight of him. Hurt. Luka snorted. I'll heal before we even make it back. You still shouldn't let it bleed out here. You know Marcus could be tracking us by scent. That wiped the smirk from his face. I tugged him toward one of the abandoned freight cars, yanking open the rusted door. Inside it was dry and cold, but better than standing out in the open where Marcus's wolves could get another shot at us. Luka ducked inside without argument, lowering himself onto the splintered floor. I crouched beside him, pulling a strip of cloth from my jacket. Hold still. His gaze followed me as I began wrapping his arm, but he stayed quiet. Too quiet. You've been distracted, I said after a moment, knotting the fabric tighter than necessary. Luka didn't even flinch. Since we left the cabin? He stared past me, jaw tight. It's nothing, he said again. But this time, there was no conviction behind the words. I'm so glad, she said. I wasn't buying it. Is it? I met his gaze, letting the silence stretch. Because Marcus didn't just happen to find us here. He knew where to look. Luka's eyes darkened, but he didn't deny it. I sat back on my heels, crossing my arms. How long have you known he was tracking us? In a few days. I blinked. And you didn't think to mention that? His muscles tensed beneath my hand, but he stayed still. I thought I could handle it, he said, finally, his voice low. I didn't want you worrying about it. I let out a sharp breath, trying to keep the frustration from boiling over. You don't get to make that call, Luka. If Marcus is coming for me, he's not coming for you, Luka cut in, his gaze locking with mine. He's coming for me. I stilled. Luka shifted, leaning forward slightly. His proximity sent a shiver racing down my spine, but I held my ground. Agio Manier, this isn't just about the prophecy, he said, voice rough around the edges. Marcus doesn't care about that, not really. This is about territory, about me. I frowned, searching his expression for the truth buried beneath. He wants me gone, Luka admitted. He's been waiting, for a reason, to challenge me. You just gave him one. The realization settled heavily between us. So, what now? I asked quietly. Luka exhaled, his breath misting in the cold air. Now? I narrowed my eyes. Leave? We can't stay near the cabin. Not with Marcus this close. It's not safe anymore. The thought of abandoning our home, our fragile little corner of peace, sent a pang through my chest. But Luka wasn't wrong. Marcus wouldn't stop. Not until Luka was either dead or driven too far away to be a threat. I nodded, pushing the ache aside. Fine, but you're not carrying this alone, Luka. If we're leaving, we're doing it together. His gaze softened. I wasn't planning on leaving you behind. I held his stare for a long moment before glancing at his arm. You're still bleeding. Luka chuckled softly. You're relentless. You're stubborn, I shot back, tying the final knot. Someone has to balance it out. His hand brushed against mine. Brief, but enough to send a ripple through the bond that tethered us. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. But outside, the wind shifted. Luka's head snapped toward the open door, eyes flashing gold. I heard it a second later, the faint crunch of snow, footsteps too heavy to belong to an animal. Marcus's wolves hadn't left. Luka was on his feet in an instant, muscles coiled tight beneath his jacket. Go, he ordered, but I was already moving. The train yard blurred around me as I slipped into the shadows, Luka at my side. The wolves weren't far behind. I could feel them closing in, their scents weaving through the icy air. Luka swore under his breath as one of them barreled toward us from the side, but I met him head on. The fight was quick and brutal. The wolf hit the ground hard, but another lunged from the opposite direction. I turned just in time to see Luka take the hit meant for me. The impact knocked him sideways, his body crashing against the cold steel of the nearest freight car. The wolf's claws raked down his side before Luka twisted, sinking his teeth into the rogue's throat. The wolf yelped and stumbled back, but Luka didn't pursue him. He swayed slightly, catching himself against the car with one hand. I ran to his side, heart hammering. Luka, I'm fine, he grunted, but the blood seeping from the wound told a different story. I wrapped an arm around his waist, pulling him forward. Come on, we're getting out of here. He didn't argue. The wolves didn't follow us this time. But I felt Marcus's gaze lingering long after we disappeared into the trees. Chapter 4, Teeth in the Dark. Marcus's scent lingered long after he was gone, wrapping around the train yard like a noose waiting to tighten. Luka sat stiffly beside me in the freight car, blood drying beneath the makeshift bandage I'd tied around his arm. The fire between us had burned down to embers, crackling softly as the cold crept back in. I should have felt safe here, hidden. But Marcus's words gnawed at the edge of my mind, refusing to let go. Surrender Aria to the council or risk war. Luka hadn't spoken since we left the clearing, but I could feel the weight of his silence pressing into me. He didn't want to tell me the rest, whatever had been left unsaid between him and Marcus. I wasn't patient enough to wait him out. I shifted, angling my body toward him. You're not actually considering it, are you? Luka's eyes flicked to mine, dark and unreadable. Considering what? You know what? His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he'd deflect, but then he exhaled through his nose and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. The council isn't going to let this slide, Aria. Marcus made sure of that. I don't care about the council. My voice sharpened, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. I'm not some rogue they can put down. You deserve to live some truth. No, Luka agreed, his gaze steady. You're something they don't understand, and that makes you dangerous. I stood, pacing the length of the freight car. The metal groaned beneath my boots. So that's it? We hand me over and hope they don't kill me. No one's handing you over, Luka said, his voice dropping into something low and hard. I stopped, turning to face him. Then what, Luka? Because Marcus isn't bluffing. He'll keep coming until he gets what he wants. His move to control. Luka's eyes flashed gold, the wolf just beneath his skin stirring. I'll handle Marcus. That's not good enough, I shot back. Not this time. The words hung between us, sharp as teeth. Luka rose slowly, closing the distance between us with quiet, deliberate steps. His heat washed over me, and for a second, I felt the primal pull that always seemed to follow him. You think I don't know that? He murmured, eyes narrowing. You think I haven't thought about Marcus coming for you every second since he showed up at the cabin? I held his gaze, refusing to back down. Then stop keeping me on the sidelines. I'm not going to sit around and let you fight my battles. His hand brushed against my arm, the touch light but grounding. It's not your fight, Aria. Like hell it isn't. Luka's grip tightened slightly. You don't understand what the council is capable of. Then explain it to me. For a moment, I saw the hesitation flicker across his face. He was trying to protect me. But it was too late for that. I was already in this, and we both knew it. Luka's gaze softened just enough to let something else slip through. Something raw and vulnerable. They won't stop at you, he said finally. If Marcus convinces them you're a threat, they'll come for me too, for anyone who tries to stand between you and them. Look, I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling deep in my chest. I'm not afraid of them, I said quietly. Luka's thumb brushed along my wrist, tracing slow circles that sent heat curling through me. I know, he murmured, but that doesn't mean I'm willing to lose you over this. His words tugged at something primal, something that felt too much like belonging. Is it? I leaned into him, resting my forehead against his chest. Luka's arm slipped around me, holding me there, like he could shield me from the rest of the world. But we both knew the world was coming. The council called 2 days later. We stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond Marcus's territory, Luka's body tense beside mine. He hadn't wanted me to come. I made sure he didn't have a choice. Last chance to stay behind, Luka said, his voice quiet but strained. I arched a brow. You really think I'd miss this? A low growl rumbled from his chest, but he didn't argue. The wolves waiting in the clearing straightened as we approached, their eyes flicking between Luka and me with barely concealed interest. Marcus stood at the center, arms crossed, smug as ever. You brought her. His gaze slid to me, sharp and calculating. Didn't think you had the spine, Luka. Luka stepped forward, his growl cutting through the air like a blade. I'm not here for your amusement, Marcus. No, you're here to beg for mercy. I stepped forward, brushing past Luka before he could stop me. If you wanted me dead, Marcus, you wouldn't have brought the council into it, I said, meeting his gaze head on. You're scared, and that tells me everything I need to know. Marcus's smile thinned, but he didn't respond. The council arrived moments later, 3 alphas older than Marcus, their eyes sharp and worn with experience. They carried the weight of their rank like a crown, and I could feel the power rolling off them in waves. The one in the center, Jonas, spoke first. You're Aria, he said, his gaze sweeping over me with mild curiosity. The hybrid. How is this for you? I lifted my chin. That's right. He studied me for a long moment before his gaze flicked to Luka. And you trust her? Luka's arm brushed against mine, solid and steady, with my life. Jonas didn't look convinced. Marcus took a step forward, his expression carefully neutral. She's dangerous, Jonas. You know the history of hybrids. They don't belong in either world. She hasn't harmed anyone, Luka countered. Yes, Marcus's eyes gleamed. But give it time. I clenched my fists, barely suppressing the urge to lunge. Luka's hand rested lightly on my lower back, grounding me. I stand by her, Luka said, voice firm. If the council wants her gone, they'll have to go through me first. Jonas's gaze lingered on Luka for a long beat before he finally nodded. We'll see how long that loyalty lasts, Marcus muttered. Luka's muscles tensed beside me, but I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. Let them try, I whispered. Luka's thumb brushed against my skin, his touch steady and warm, despite the cold stares pressing in around us. If war was coming, we'd face it together. The council's decision hung in the air like a loaded gun. Jonas hadn't given Marcus the answer he wanted, but he hadn't protected me either. We were in dangerous limbo, one that Marcus would twist to his advantage the first chance he got. I could feel Luka's tension through the bond we shared, silent but thick, curling under his skin like a second layer. His hand tightened around mine, steady but ready to snap if provoked. Marcus lingered after the council retreated into the woods, his pack circling just beyond the clearing like vultures waiting for something to die. Gwyn, Julian, and Will helped him to his feet. His gaze dragged over me, calculating, predatory. This isn't over, Marcus said, voice soft enough to almost sound like a promise. His eyes flicked to Luka. You can't protect her forever. Luka stepped forward, blocking Marcus's view of me. Try me. Marcus's grin didn't fade, but I caught the flicker of irritation in his eyes. I look forward to it. Luka didn't turn his back on him as we left the clearing. I could feel Marcus's gaze pressing into my spine the entire walk back to the cabin, but I refused to glance over my shoulder. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. I am so grateful that I have such kind, helpful. By the time we crossed the river that separated Luka's territory from Marcus's, the weight between us had grown unbearable. Luka's silence pressed hard against the edges of my control, stretching it too thin. When we reached the cabin, I'd had enough. I followed Luka inside, slamming the door behind me. The force rattled the walls, but he didn't so much as flinch. Are you going to say something, or are we just going to pretend that didn't happen? I demanded. Luka shrugged off his jacket, hanging it by the door with too much precision. What do you want me to say? That you have a plan, that Marcus isn't going to keep coming after us until one of us is dead. He turned, his eyes catching the flicker of firelight. I do have a plan. Great. When were you planning on telling me? His lips pressed into a thin line. I was hoping I wouldn't have to. I took a step closer, the frustration burning through me hotter than it should have. I deserve to know what we're walking into, Luka. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You think I don't know that? You think I like hiding things from you? Then stop. His gaze snapped to mine, the gold in his eyes burning brighter. I'm trying to keep you alive, Aria. August sighed. I never asked you to. The words hit harder than I expected, ringing in the quiet cabin like a slap. Luka stiffened. For the first time since we met, I saw something close to hurt flash across his face. I swallowed hard, regret gnawing at the back of my throat. I didn't mean. Yes, you did, Luka cut in, his voice rough. He paced the length of the room, muscles tight beneath his skin. You think this is easy for me? Every time Marcus comes sniffing around, I see what's coming. I know what he's capable of. He stopped, fists clenched at his sides. I already lost someone to him once, he said slowly. His words stopped me cold. I remembered the story he told me at the train yard. The hybrid his pack hunted. The one he couldn't save. In your kind, this isn't the same, I said softly. Isn't it? Luka's eyes narrowed. Marcus won't stop, Aria. He'll keep pushing until you break. And if you don't, his jaw tightened. He'll make sure I do. I crossed the room, stopping just short of touching him. You're not going to lose me, I said quietly. Luka's gaze dropped to mine, but something in the bond shifted. Uncertain, frayed. You can't promise that, he murmured. My heart hammered harder. No, I admitted. But I can fight. The tension between us snapped taut. Luka's hand brushed against my arm, rough and warm, grounding me in ways words never could. But even as his touch steadied me, the fire beneath my skin burned hotter. I didn't realize how much until I caught the flicker of silver in my reflection. Just for a heartbeat. Sally Fleming, who's my mentor. I froze, breath catching in my throat. Luka must have felt it. His head tilted slightly, his gaze sharpening as he studied me. What was that? He asked softly. I swallowed, the heat coiling in my chest, refusing to die down. Got my IB done. Luka took a step back, his eyes never leaving mine. Your eyes? I didn't need to ask. I'd felt the shift deep in my bones, the way the infection curled tighter around my veins. Recovering with pleasure, the old man returned, his cane clanking along the deck of the boat. It wasn't just the wolf stirring anymore. Something else lived there. Something older. Luka, I began, but the words faltered. He didn't answer right away. His hand rose slowly, brushing against the side of my face, as if to reassure himself that I was still the same. I am. His thumb lingered at my jaw, tracing the edge of my scar. We'll figure it out, he said quietly, but his gaze stayed locked on mine. I didn't believe him. Not this time, because deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was happening to me, It wasn't something Luka or anyone else could stop. Chapter 5: The Full Moon's Price. The council's chamber sat deep in the heart of neutral ground, far from any Pax territory. The old stone structure had no roof, just jagged walls clawing toward the sky, open to the moonlight that pooled inside like liquid silver. I stood at Luka's side as the alphas gathered in a loose circle around us, their eyes sharp and unkind. I could feel their gazes prickling along my skin, like wolves circling prey. Now you ask me why I'm here. Luka's hand rested at the small of my back, his fingers a warm, grounding weight. He wasn't just standing beside me. He was shielding me from them, from what was coming. Marcus lounged across the circle, arms folded as if this was nothing more than entertainment. His smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, but his eyes betrayed him. He wanted this to end with blood. Mine or Luka's. Jonas, the head of the council, lifted a hand and the murmurs died. His pale eyes drifted from Luka to me, lingering on the scar Luka's bite had left at the base of my neck. Legister Levenswets stared at the girl, as if unable to believe his own eyes. "Let's begin," Jonas said, his voice echoing through the chamber. Marcus wasted no time stepping forward, his boots grinding against the stone floor. He moved like he already owned the room. "There's no need to draw this out," Marcus said, pacing lazily. "We all know why we're here." His gaze swept to me, lingering like a thorn beneath the skin. "She doesn't belong in our world. Hybrids never do." Luka's growl rumbled low and deep, vibrating through the space between us. Marcus smiled. "That protective streak of yours is admirable, Luka, but even you can't deny the risk." "I haven't seen her as a risk," Jonas interrupted. His gaze shifted to me, heavier than before. "But I do sense something different." I stiffened under his scrutiny, but held his gaze. "She's a hybrid," Marcus cut in, his voice smooth but pointed. "Different doesn't begin to cover it." "How long until she loses control? How long before she turns on one of us?" "I'm standing right here," I said sharply, stepping out from Luka's shadow. Marcus's eyes flicked to me, his smirk widening. "That's the problem." Luka moved closer, his shoulder brushing mine. "You forget who she is," he said. "Aria's not a threat. She's more in control than half the wolves in your pack." "That's not what I heard," Marcus shot back. "Rumor has it she nearly ripped apart one of my scouts a few nights ago." The memory burned hot under my skin. The rogue wolf at the train yard, the taste of his blood, lingering longer than it should have. "They attack first," Luka said flatly. Jonas's gaze narrowed. "Is that true?" I swallowed, feeling the weight of the council's eyes bearing down on me. "It is. And yet," Marcus mused, "you didn't kill him." "Why?" "'Cause I almost said, because I wanted to." Luka's fingers brushed my wrist, a silent reminder that he was still there, still standing between me and them. "I stopped myself," I said. Marcus arched a brow. "How noble." Luka's growl deepened. "Watch your mouth." Jonas raised his hand, cutting Luka off before he could say more. "We aren't here to pass judgment on what's already been done," Jonas said. His eyes drifted back to me. "But Marcus isn't wrong about one thing. Hybrids are unpredictable." I forced myself to stay still as Jonas stepped closer, his gaze searching for something I wasn't sure even I could explain. "Which leaves us with a choice," he said quietly. We can allow you to stay under Luka's protection and risk what may come. Or we take precautions. Luka tensed beside me. What kind of precautions? Jonas's gaze never left mine. The full moon is in 3 days, he said. We'll observe her then. If she loses control, his voice dropped. You'll deal with it, Luka, or we will. The meaning behind his words cut deeper than I expected. Luka's jaw tightened, his hand dropping from my back. No, it's not a choice, Jonas replied. Either you handle this, or you both face exile. I kept my face still, but inside, something cracked. Luka didn't answer. His silence said enough. Jonas stepped back, casting one last glance in my direction before motioning to Marcus. We're done here. The council began to file out, but Marcus lingered, his smirk as sharp as the bite of winter air. See you at the full moon, he said, his gaze locking onto me. Try not to lose yourself, Aria. I watched him disappear into the shadows, Luka's quiet fury radiating beside me. When we were alone, Luka turned to face me, but I stepped away, putting space between us. You're not actually agreeing to this, I said, my voice cold. Luka's eyes softened, but guilt flickered beneath the surface. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice, I snapped. The bond between us strained, pulling taut like a thread about to snap. Luka stepped closer, his voice dropping low. You think I want this? That I'm not doing everything I can to keep you safe? I swallowed hard, fighting against the knot in my throat. You agreed to kill me if I lose control, I whispered. Luka's eyes darkened. That's not going to happen. She resumed baking and waiting. You don't know that. His hand brushed against my cheek, warm despite the cold creeping into the chamber. I do, Luka murmured. I know you, Aria, and I know you're stronger than whatever's inside you. Aleko turned her face up. I wanted to believe him. But as the moon rose higher, silver light spilling across the stones, I caught my reflection in the glass of a broken window. For just a moment, my eyes weren't their usual deep brown. They were silver. I love him. And something told me Luka's faith might not be enough. The council chamber felt colder after they left, as if the weight of their decision had sucked the life from the air. Luka's hand lingered at the small of my back, a silent anchor keeping me from unraveling. I should have said something, but the words stuck to the roof of my mouth like ash. Luka turned, his gaze fixed on the exit where Marcus had disappeared. His shoulders remained tense, his wolf just beneath the surface. This doesn't mean anything, Luka muttered more to himself than to me. They won't touch you. I stared at the empty space where the council had stood, the moonlight casting long shadows through the broken roof. You can't promise that, I said quietly. Luka's silence spoke louder than words. We left the chamber, walking side by side in tense silence. The forest pressed close, branches clawing at the sky as if trying to trap the moonlight beneath them. The path back to the cabin felt longer than before, each step heavier than the last. Luka kept glancing at me, but I didn't meet his eyes. Not yet. By the time we crossed the river, the weight between us had thickened, coiling around my chest like a snake, ready to strike. Aria. Luka's voice was softer now, but I didn't stop walking. I felt him follow, his presence a constant heat against my back. You're angry, he said, catching up to me with ease. No, I replied, shoving my hands into the pockets of my jacket. I'm scared. Luka fell silent, his expression unreadable. You think I'll lose control? You should. I finally met his gaze, and something flickered behind his eyes. Something he couldn't hide, no matter how hard he tried. She began again steadily, slowly putting his face away. Marcus is using this, Luka said. That's all this is. Politics. It's not about you. I huffed a bitter laugh, shaking my head. It's always about me, Luka. It's about what I am, what I could become. Luka's hand curled around my arm, pulling me to a stop. His grip wasn't tight, but it held me there, forcing me to look at him. You're not alone in this. I wanted to believe him. But the silver in my eyes earlier told a different story. The cabin sat dark and quiet when we returned. Luka unlocked the door, his movements slower than usual. You should rest, he said as I stepped inside. I shrugged off my jacket, hanging it by the door. I won't sleep. Luka hesitated, watching me. The tension in his shoulders hadn't eased since the council meeting. I'll keep watch, he offered. I nodded, knowing better than to argue. But as Luka moved to light the fire, I felt something shift behind me. It wasn't Luka's presence. Someone else was there. I turned sharply, senses flaring. Marcus stood just outside the open cabin door, leaning against the frame, like he belonged there. Luka was at my side in seconds, his growl rumbling low enough to rattle the floorboards. You've got some nerve, Luka snarled, stepping in front of me. Marcus's eyes flicked lazily to him. Relax. I'm not here to fight. Luka didn't move. Leave. Marcus ignored him, his attention settling on me. I came to talk to her, Marcus said, his voice smooth and casual, but there was an edge beneath it, one that raised every hair on the back of my neck. I have nothing to say to you, I replied coldly. Marcus smirked. You might want to hear me out. Luka's grip on the knife strapped to his thigh tightened, but he didn't draw it. Marcus's eyes gleamed. I'm offering you a way out, Aria. I stiffened. A way out? If... Marcus stepped closer, ignoring Luka's glare. Join me. The council won't touch you if you're under my protection. I can teach you to control whatever's stirring inside you. Uka's growl deepened, but Marcus didn't flinch. You can barely control your own pack, Luka snapped. She's not yours to recruit. Marcus's gaze lingered on me, his expression softening in a way that made my skin crawl. You're strong, Aria. I can see it, feel it. But strength like yours needs guidance. I met his gaze, refusing to waver. You mean control? Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. Call it what you want. But when the full moon rises, you'll either be standing with me or against me. And if it's the latter, his smile thinned. Luka won't be enough to protect you. I felt Luka shift closer, his presence a solid wall between Marcus and me. I'm not scared of you, I said. Marcus's smirk returned, slow and deliberate. You should be. Luka took a step forward, and Marcus held up his hands in mock surrender. Relax, Marcus said, retreating toward the trees. I've said my piece. The offer stands until the full moon. His eyes met mine one last time. Think it over, Aria. You won't like what happens if you say no. With that, he vanished into the woods, his footsteps fading until the forest swallowed him whole. Luka exhaled sharply, pacing the length of the room before slamming the door shut behind him. Don't listen to him, Luka growled, rubbing a hand down his face. He's trying to get inside your head. I didn't answer, because no matter how much I hated Marcus, I couldn't deny the truth behind his words. I could feel it. The full moon was coming, and with it, something I might not be able to stop. Chapter 6. Beneath the Skin. I waited until Luka fell asleep. His breathing was even, chest rising and falling in the darkened cabin, with a rhythm I'd memorized. I lay beside him for an hour, staring at the ceiling and listening for the soft hitch in his breath that told me he drifted far enough into sleep that he wouldn't hear me leave. By the time I slid out of bed, the moon had risen high, spilling silver light through the window and washing the cabin floor in ghostly patterns. I moved carefully, not daring to look back. If Luka woke and saw me sneaking out, I'd never hear the end of it. Worse, he'd follow. I slipped into the cold without making a sound. The forest stretched wide and dark around the cabin. The trees older than most men had a right to live, their roots twisted up from the ground like knotted fingers, and the wind tugged at my hair as if the woods themselves wanted me to stay. But I couldn't. I needed this. I needed to know the truth. The infection had been there since Luka's bite, coiled beneath my skin, a low hum of energy that never fully faded. It stirred at night when I let my guard down, waiting, like a second heartbeat thudding just beneath my own. I could feel it now, prickling along my spine as I stepped deeper into the trees. Luka thought he could protect me from this, like sheer force of will alone would be enough to keep the shift at bay. But he was wrong. Marcus wasn't wrong about everything. That was the dangerous part. I could feel it, the animal inside me stretching closer to the surface every day. The full moon was coming, and I didn't know if I could hold the line when it did. That's why I was out here, barefoot in the snow, while Luka slept soundly in the bed we shared. I had to test myself. The clearing opened ahead, a patch of sky cut bare between the trees. The air hummed with power, the kind that sank into my skin like static, tugging at the parts of me that didn't belong to either shifter or wolf. I pulled my shirt over my head, letting the cold bite into my skin. My breaths fogged in the air, loud in the hush of the clearing. Focus. I closed my eyes and let the shift come. It wasn't like Luka's smooth, practiced, a dance between human and wolf that he'd perfected over years. Mine was jagged, raw. The infection twisted through my veins, and when the change took hold, it didn't let go easily. I felt my bones strain, reshaping into something sharper, more predatory. Fur rippled along my arms, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears as the shift dragged me under. When I opened my eyes, the world was sharper, clearer. I could hear the wind brushing against the branches, smell the faint scent of deer in the distance. Deer, but beneath that, beneath the cold night air and the snow, there was something else, a new scent. Marcus. My wolf bristled, hackles rising as I turned toward the scent trail. It was faint but fresh, weaving through the trees like a challenge, waiting to be answered. I shouldn't have followed it, but I did. My paws barely made a sound as I moved, slipping between the trees like a shadow. The hunger coiled low in my stomach, thrumming alongside the infection that never quite faded. I didn't notice the second scent until it was too late. Luka. He appeared between the trees, bare-chested, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. His presence hit me like a stone wall, and I skidded to a stop. Minnie? I shifted back without thinking, the cold rushing over me in waves as I straightened, chest heaving. What are you doing out here? Luka's voice was calm, but his eyes held something sharper. I crossed my arms over my bare skin, teeth chattering against the cold. I could ask you the same thing. Luka stepped closer, offering his jacket without a word. I took it, sliding into the warm fabric, even as his scent clung to me. You were following him, Luka said, glancing at the ground where Marcus's scent lingered. Has been near the cabin. I know, Luka replied. I narrowed my eyes. You didn't think to tell me? You had enough to worry about. I let out a sharp breath, pacing the edge of the clearing. You can't keep shielding me from this. I need to know what's happening. Luka didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. You don't know what it's like to lose control. His gaze found mine, something vulnerable flickering behind his eyes. I do. I stepped closer, the weight of his words settling into my chest. Then help me, I said softly. Luka's hand brushed against my arm, a brief but grounding touch. His fingers curled around mine, pulling me gently toward him. You think I don't want to, he murmured, but every time I look at you, I see what's coming. His forehead rested against mine, the warmth of his breath brushing against my lips. I can't lose you, Aria. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering loud enough that I was sure he could hear it. We've got... You won't. The bond between us hummed, fragile but unyielding. Luka's grip tightened, his lips brushing against the corner of my mouth in a kiss that felt more like a promise than anything else. But beneath that, the infection stirred, and deep down I knew, no matter how much Luka tried to protect me, when the full moon rose, I would have to face this alone. Luka's warmth lingered long after his touch faded, but as he pulled back, the weight behind his eyes stayed. I could feel it, unspoken, unrelenting. We stood there for a long time, caught in that fragile space between confession and denial. But the forest around us didn't wait. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance, the sharp crack cutting through the quiet. Luka's head snapped up, muscles coiling as he shifted half a step in front of me. The wolf in him rose so fast it made my skin prickle. I didn't have to ask. I already knew who it was. Amen. I watched as the old shifter stepped into the clearing, his fur-lined cloak draped over one shoulder. His sharp eyes flicked from Luka to me, taking in the closeness, the tension. You two always had a habit of sneaking around under the moon, Eamon said casually, his voice low and rough. Brings back memories. You're far from the borders, Eamon, Luka growled, crossing his arms over his chest. What you want? Eamon smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. I came to speak with Aria, Eamon replied, ignoring Luka's posturing. His eyes settled on me, unreadable and sharp. Alone. Luka shifted, the air around him crackling with protective energy. That's not happening. Eamon arched a brow, deepened. I stepped between them, raising a hand toward Luka's chest. His muscles tensed under my touch, but he stopped short of snapping. It's fine, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. Luka's eyes burned into mine. No, it's not. I'll handle it. Luka held my gaze for a long moment, his reluctance radiating through the bond we shared. Finally, he exhaled sharply and stepped back. I'll stay close, he nodded, waiting until Luka disappeared into the trees before turning toward Eamon. The old shifter watched Luka go, his sharp eyes narrowing. He'd tear my throat out if he thought I was a threat, Eamon mused. He's protective, I said. Eamon smiled, but there was something colder beneath it. Protective? Eamon echoed. Or possessive? I stiffened. Luka's not like that. Eamon's gaze slid to mine, sharp and knowing. Maybe not yet. I crossed my arms, suddenly regretting letting Luka walk away. Why are you really here, Amond? Amond stepped closer, the faint scent of sage and smoke trailing behind him. I warned you once, he said softly, and I'm warning you again. Luka's loyalty is strong, but even that has limits. A cold weight settled in my chest. Amon met my eyes, his voice low and even. When the council forces his hand, you might find that bond tested in ways you aren't ready for. I clenched my fists, fighting to keep my voice steady. Luka wouldn't betray me. Amon's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. He won't think it's betrayal, Amon said. He'll think it's survival. The words twisted deep, cutting through the fragile confidence I held onto. I wanted to argue, but the flicker of doubt had already taken root. You should ask him, Amon continued, his gaze softening, almost pitying. Ask him what he'll do when the council forces him to choose. He turned, stepping back into the trees. Because they will. The shadows swallowed him, leaving me alone in the clearing with nothing but the cold and the uncomfortable weight pressing against my ribs. I didn't realize I was trembling until Luka returned, his eyes flicking over me like he already knew. What did he say to you? Luka's voice was quiet, but tension rolled off him in waves. I met his gaze, swallowing the words burning the tip of my tongue. Nothing I didn't already know. Chapter 7. The Pull of the Moon. The second coming, the woods whispered louder under a full moon. I felt it thrumming beneath my skin as I crossed the frostbitten clearing, the infection stirring like a second heartbeat. Every step deepened the pull, each breath curling in the cold air as if something waited just out of sight. I shouldn't have come. The thought repeated with each crunch of snow beneath my boots, but it wasn't enough to turn me around, not when the weight of Marcus's voice still echoed in my mind. Alil Normuna, I can help you, Aria. I can show you how to control it. And I hated him for it, but I hated myself more for wanting to hear him out. Luka would kill me if he knew, and maybe that's why I didn't tell him. The trees pressed close as I stepped deeper into neutral ground, their bare branches clawing at the moon. Marcus waited where he said he'd be, leaning casually against an old oak, with his arms crossed and that wolfish grin stretched across his face. He looked, too, at ease for someone trespassing so close to Luka's borders. All was quiet. You're late, Marcus said, pushing off the tree as I approached. I kept my distance, stopping just short of where the moonlight pooled in the snow. I shouldn't be here. I knew it. And yet here you are. Marcus's gaze dragged over me, but it wasn't predatory this time. More curious. What changed? He asked. Nothing, I snapped. You're wasting your time. His smirk didn't fade. Maybe. I gritted my teeth, feeling the low hum of energy twisting beneath my skin. You said you could help, I said, the words cold as they left my mouth. Prove it. Marcus stopped, his head tilting slightly. Luka wouldn't approve. I don't care what Luka thinks. Marcus arched a brow. No. The lie tasted bitter, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. Marcus stepped closer, crossing the invisible line I'd drawn between us. The air shifted with him, laced with the sharp tang of power that always seemed to follow in his wake. You feel it, don't you? Marcus's voice dropped lower, the words curling against my skin like smoke. The shift coming faster, the hunger pressing harder. You think you can bury it, but the closer we get to the full moon, you. He leaned in, just enough for his breath to brush the side of my neck. That felt too easy. I wasn't quite ready. The more it'll own you. I stiffened, forcing myself not to move, not to flinch. I'm not afraid of it, I said, but even I wasn't sure if that was the truth. Marcus's lips twitched, his eyes gleaming faintly in the dark. Good. He stepped back, giving me space I didn't realize I'd needed. Let me show you, Aria. You don't have to fight this alone. I hated how tempting those words sounded. I opened my mouth to tell him to go to hell, but the sound of movement behind me stopped whatever excuse I might have found. Marcus's gaze flicked over my shoulder. His smirk returned, slower this time. You should have told him, Marcus drawled. I turned, heart sinking as Luka stepped out from the shadows, his expression unreadable. His eyes locked onto mine first, cool, calculating, before they drifted to Marcus. I should have known, Luka said, voice rough. Marcus chuckled softly, spreading his arms. Don't blame her. She's curious. You can't fault her for that. Luka's gaze darkened. You're trespassing. Ruby gave him a wave, and he passed by. Am I? Marcus's smirk widened. Seems more like an invitation to me. I stepped between them, before Luka's growl could slip into something more dangerous. It's not what you think, I said quickly, hating how hollow the excuse sounded, even to me. Luka's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I couldn't read what lingered behind them. Isn't it? He asked softly. Marcus lingered behind me, his presence pressing close without touching. Luka's focus stayed on me, but I saw the shift in his posture, the tension coiling in his shoulders, the faint glow of gold flickering at the edge of his irises. You should leave, Luka said, his voice calm but firm. Marcus didn't move. I don't take orders from you, Luka. The air grew heavier. I felt Luka's control splinter, the wolf beneath his skin inching closer to the surface with every breath Marcus took. I said, leave. Luka's growl rumbled low, vibrating through the clearing. Marcus held his ground for a moment longer, testing the weight of the threat hanging between them, before finally stepping back. His eyes found mine one last time. The offer stands, Marcus said, his voice soft but dangerous. You'll need me soon enough. Luka didn't move until Marcus's footsteps faded into the woods, leaving the clearing empty, but still charged with tension. Silence stretched between us, thicker than the cold. You lied, Luka said, breaking the quiet. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. I didn't. You didn't tell me, Luka cut in, his eyes sharp. That's the same thing. The bond between us twisted, strained by the weight of what I couldn't explain. I needed answers, Luka. His expression didn't change. And you thought Marcus was the one to give them to you? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Luka took a slow step forward, his gaze narrowing. Is that what this is now? You trusting him over me? No, I said quickly, the word sharp enough to cut. Luka's stare lingered, measuring the truth in my voice. I am trying to protect you, he said, the roughness softening. But you have to let me. I took a breath, the weight of his words sinking into the space between us. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Luka stepped back, his eyes darker than before. Let's go home, he said quietly. But even as we walked side by side through the woods, I felt the distance growing. And this time, I wasn't sure how to close it. Luka's footsteps hit harder against the frozen ground than mine. He didn't bother masking his frustration, each step cutting deeper into the path that wound back toward the cabin. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, heavy and jagged. He hadn't said much since Marcus left, but the tension hung between us like a blade. Ah, Luka walked a few feet ahead, his shoulders rigid. His silence wasn't cold, it burned, blistering through the fragile space that held us together. I hated it. Luka, he didn't stop. I picked up my pace, matching his long strides. You're overreacting. His head snapped toward me, eyes flashing gold in the moonlight. You met with Marcus alone? How exactly should I be reacting, Aria? I clenched my fists at my sides. I wasn't plotting with him, Luka. I was looking for answers, something you won't give me. Luka stopped so fast, I nearly ran into him. His eyes narrowed, sharp enough to make me flinch. You think I'm keeping things from you? I held my ground, ignoring the twisting knot of guilt lodged between my ribs. You're holding back, I said quietly. You've been doing it since the council threatened exile. You think I can't feel it? Luca's jaw flexed, but he didn't deny it. That's not the same as lying, he said tightly. It feels the same. His gaze lingered on me for a long moment, but something in him shifted. I saw it in the way his shoulders sank, the tension bleeding out, but leaving something heavier behind. Somehow, you don't understand what's at stake. His voice softened, but there was no warmth in it. I stepped closer, the bond between us humming faintly under the weight of the words we weren't saying. Then explain it to me. Luca's eyes darkened, and for a heartbeat, I thought he might. But instead, he pulled away. I need space, Luka muttered, turning back toward the trees. Don't follow me. I froze. His words struck hard and fast, leaving behind an ache I hadn't been ready for. Luka, I mean it, Aria. His tone wasn't harsh, but it carved into me all the same. Luka disappeared into the woods without another glance, his footsteps fading into the dark until I couldn't hear him anymore. I didn't like the clearing felt colder without him. I took a slow breath, watching it curl in the frigid air, and forced myself to stay still. Luka needed space. I could give him that, even if every instinct screamed at me to chase after him. I lingered for a moment longer before turning toward the cabin. But the second I stepped onto the path, I felt it, eyes in the dark. I wasn't alone. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent I didn't recognize. It wasn't Marcus. I took another step forward, listening carefully. The forest held its breath, but the weight of someone watching pressed down on me like a warning. Bees. The realization hit like ice water down my spine. Luka was gone, and whoever was out there knew it. I exhaled slowly, scanning the tree line. The shadows didn't move, but I felt them circling. Predators testing the edges of the kill. I wasn't helpless. If Marcus thought leaving me vulnerable would earn him points with the council, he'd underestimated me. I crouched low, slipping silently between the trees, following the faint thread of their scent. They weren't far. The first one materialized from the shadows a few feet ahead, half hidden behind a fallen log. His scent hit me first. Wolf, but unfamiliar. Not Marcus's pack. His eyes met mine briefly, but he didn't attack. He was testing me, waiting. I straightened slowly, letting the moonlight catch the faint silver still lingering in my eyes. Are you lost? I asked, my voice calm, despite the coil tightening in my chest. The wolf didn't respond, but another shape shifted behind him. A second figure stepped into the clearing, tall and lean, with dark eyes that gleamed faintly under the moon. Thank you, I said. The wolf nodded. Marcus? Someone else. The second wolf smiled faintly, but it wasn't friendly. Just curious, he said smoothly. You're not what I expected. Really loved teaching in this way. That I didn't move. Who said ya? The wolf tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking toward where Luka had vanished. You're a hard one to track. We wanted to know why. His voice carried that same practiced ease Marcus used. Smooth, calculated. But he wasn't here to negotiate. I stepped closer, letting the infection rise just enough to sharpen my senses. The shift stirred beneath my skin, eager and restless. I'd pick another night to be curious, I said, my voice dropping lower, before Luka comes back. The second wolf's smirk didn't fade. Luka is not here, he mused, and something tells me you're not as in control as you pretend to be. I clenched my fists at my sides, biting back the urge to let the shift pull me under completely. No, I'm in control enough. The first wolf shifted slightly, weight shifting onto the balls of his feet. Ready. I caught the movement, but I didn't step back. If you're smart, I said evenly, you'll tell Marcus to keep his spies out of my woods. The second wolf's eyes flashed gold, but his smirk lingered. Marcus didn't send us. My stomach twisted, but I didn't let it show. I kept my posture loose, but inside everything tightened. They weren't Marcus's, which meant someone else had taken an interest. The second wolf took another step forward, his gaze sliding over me, like he was memorizing something. We'll be seeing you, Aria. I didn't blink as he turned and melted back into the trees, the first wolf following silently behind him. The forest swallowed their presence, but I stayed rooted to the spot, listening until the faintest traces of their scent faded entirely. Even then, I didn't move. I stayed there, alone, under the weight of the moon, and realized two things. Marcus wasn't the only threat I had to face, and Luka wouldn't always be there to stand between me and the wolves, waiting in the dark. Chapter 8. Wolves on the Edge. The river marked the line between Luka's territory and Marcus's. It wasn't wide, 3 strides at best, but the weight of it felt more like a canyon stretched between 2 worlds that could never coexist. Slowly, she became conscious of rocks, silting, bending. Luka stood on the near side, arms crossed, watching the trees on the opposite bank. Marcus was late, and Luka's patience was thinning. I felt it in the way his fingers flexed subtly against his biceps, like he was itching for a fight. You don't have to do this, I said quietly. Luka didn't look at me. His eyes stayed on the shadows just beyond the trees, tracking every shift in the underbrush. Yes, I do. I stepped closer, my shoulder brushing his. His heat sank into me, but the distance between us lingered. You're not his keeper, I said. Whatever he's playing at, it's not your fight. His eyes flicked to mine, sharp and golden in the half-light. It is, if he keeps dragging you into it. Before I could argue, Marcus emerged from the trees like he'd been waiting for the tension to peak. Look at that, Marcus said, stepping onto the icy stones along the riverbank. I half expected you to stay in bed and let her come alone. Luka's growl vibrated through the air, low and menacing. His wolf rode just beneath the surface, and I could almost see the shift rippling beneath his skin. Watch your mouth, Luka warned. Marcus's grin only grew. I'm just pointing out the obvious. Aria doesn't need you hovering over her every move. Maybe she likes having options. I stiffened, but Luka moved faster. In a blink, Luka crossed the river and slammed Marcus against the nearest tree. The bark cracked and Marcus's smirk vanished as Luka's forearm pressed into his throat. You think you can walk into my territory and sniff around Aria like she's yours to claim? Luka's voice dropped lower, rough with the edge of something feral. I should break you for even suggesting it. Marcus's eyes flashed gold, the wolf inside him pushing forward to meet Luka's dominance. His lips twisted into something cold, dangerous. I'm not the one claiming her, Marcus rasped, voice strained beneath Luka's weight. That's all you, Luka. You think you're protecting her, but you're just leading her straight to the council's teeth. Luka didn't ease up. If anything, his grip tightened. Keep pushing and see how far you get. For a heartbeat, I thought Luka might snap Marcus's neck right there. His wolf hovered dangerously close to the surface, and I knew Luka well enough to sense when his control started to slip. I moved forward, placing a hand on Luka's shoulder. Luka, stop. His muscles coiled under my touch, but he didn't let go. Marcus met my gaze, his expression shifting just enough to let me see the real him beneath the bravado. Calculated, always testing for weaknesses. The corners of Michael's mouth twitched. I decided not to learn what was in there. This is cute, Marcus rasped. But if you wanted to make a point, you should have done it sooner. Next, Luka growled, his teeth lengthening slightly. The shift crept closer, pulling at the edges of his control. Luka, I said again, this time firmer. Let him go. Luka's gaze snapped to mine, and for a second his eyes were more wolf than man. But something in my face must have pulled him back, because his grip loosened. Marcus dropped to the ground, coughing lightly but grinning like he'd won the fight. The temper's going to get you killed someday, Marcus said, rubbing his neck. Luka didn't answer. He stepped back, but the tension in his body didn't ease. Marcus's gaze drifted lazily between us, lingering a little too long on me. She'll slip eventually, Marcus said, eyes gleaming. And when she does, the council won't hesitate. You know that, don't you, Luka? Luka's hand twitched at his side, but he didn't take the bait. Marcus's smirk faded. Loyalty's a funny thing. I wonder if it'll hold when she turns, and you're the one standing in front of her. Luka lunged forward, but Marcus shifted, his body twisting as the first hints of fur rippled along his arms. Luka's wolf answered instantly, claws sliding free as his bones cracked, the shift dragging both of them dangerously close to the edge. I stepped between them, pressing a hand against Luka's chest before the shift could take him fully. Enough, I said quietly. Luka's breathing was harsh, ragged, but he didn't move. Marcus pulled back, the shift retreating just as fast as it had come. I'll see you both at the full moon, Marcus said, brushing snow from his jacket. His eyes met mine for half a breath longer than they should have. Luka didn't take his eyes off Marcus until he disappeared into the trees. When the forest finally settled, Luka exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. That bastard is going to push until one of us breaks. I stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. And you're letting him. Luka's gaze met mine, and for a second, the anger softened into something rawer. I don't trust him around you, Luka admitted, his voice low. I know, I said, moving closer until our bodies nearly touched. Luka's hand slid around the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair as his lips brushed against mine. Soft at first, then harder. Desperate. The kiss burned away the cold, pulling me under with the force of everything we hadn't said. Reaching for her chair, she propped her elbows on her lap. When we finally broke apart, his forehead rested against mine, and his breath came in short bursts. "It won't stop," Luka whispered. "Neither will we," I replied. And for that moment, it was enough. Marcus's eyes flashed gold, but Luka didn't ease the pressure. The air between them thickened, vibrating with the unspoken threat of claws and teeth just beneath the surface. I could feel it too, the slow creep of the shift curling beneath Luka's skin, begging for release. Marcus bared his teeth in a twisted grin. "There it is," he rasped against Luka's forearm. "You feel it, don't you? The edge. You're just like the rest of us." Luka's grip tightened. "Luka," I said, stepping closer. His breathing slowed, but the feral gleam in his eyes didn't fade. "He's baiting you," I warned. Marcus's gaze shifted to me, lazy and predatory. "Maybe, but at least I'm honest about what I am." Luka shoved him back hard enough to make Marcus stumble, but he didn't press the attack. "Get out of my sight," Luka growled, his voice barely human. Marcus straightened, brushing dirt from his jacket, like Luka hadn't just pinned him to a tree. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his smirk returning as his eyes lingered on me. "It never is." Luka stepped between us before Marcus could get any closer. "Go." Marcus chuckled under his breath. "See you at the next full moon, Aria." His words slithered into the cold air as he disappeared back into the woods, leaving Luka and me alone beneath the trees. Luka didn't move for a long time. His shoulders stayed rigid, his breathing shallow as the wolf inside him slowly receded. I waited until the tension bled from his muscles before stepping up beside him. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly. Luka's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on the river. "It was too close to you," Luka muttered. I reached for his arm, brushing my fingers against his skin. "I can handle Marcus." Luka's gaze finally met mine. The gold still lingered in his eyes, but beneath it, something else flickered. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. Being in the same room with him drew on some of that. "You shouldn't have to," Luka said softly. His guard slipped, just for a moment. That's when I saw it. The edge of a scar peeked out from beneath his shoulder blade, pale against the ridges of his skin. I hadn't noticed it before. Luka rarely shifted in front of me, and he wasn't the type to bear his wounds willingly. I stepped behind him, brushing the fabric of his shirt aside to reveal more. The scar was deep, jagged, and old, stretching from the base of his shoulder down toward the curve of his spine. I traced it lightly with my fingertips, feeling the roughness beneath my touch. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Luka tensed beneath my hand. "It's nothing." I didn't believe him. "Luka." He exhaled slowly, but he didn't turn around. "It happened before I left my pack," Luka admitted, his tone stripped of its usual defenses. "Marcus wasn't the first wolf I had to face." My fingers lingered over the scar. "Who was?" Luka hesitated, but I waited. "My father," Luka said at last. The words hung between us, heavier than I expected. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. Luka rarely spoke about his past, his old pack, the things he left behind. This wasn't something he offered lightly. "Well?" I asked gently. Luka finally turned to face me, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Because I didn't kill the hybrid they told me to," he said. "I chose her over the pack, and I paid for it. The scar, the tension, the weight he carried every time Marcus circled too close." Describing it all made sense now. I reached for him without thinking, curling my hand around the back of his neck. Luka's eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't pull away. You saved her, I said quietly. Luka's gaze dropped to the space between us. Not for long. I felt the sharp edge of his guilt bleeding through the bond we shared, the kind that didn't fade, no matter how much time passed. The fishmaster sighed, bordering on weariness. He wasn't you, Aria, Luka murmured. I won't let the same thing happen again. His words stirred something deep in my chest, something equal parts warmth and ache. I brushed my thumb along the ridge of his scar, feeling the steady pulse beneath his skin. Before you forget, you're not that wolf anymore, I whispered. Luka's eyes lifted to mine, and for once, he let the wall between us fall completely. The bond hummed, thrumming softly beneath the weight of everything left unsaid. I hope you're right, Luka murmured, his hand covering mine. I leaned into him, resting my forehead against his chest as his arms slipped around me. For now, the fight was over. But Marcus's words lingered, curling at the edges of my mind like smoke refusing to fade. Honeybee Hearts, Chapter 9. The Beast Beneath. The moon hung low, swollen and full, dripping silver light onto the snow-dusted clearing outside the cabin. I felt it before I saw them, the pull of Marcus's wolves lurking at the edges of Luka's territory, like vultures circling something wounded. I stood near the tree line, my skin prickling with unease. Luka was somewhere behind me, his presence like a shadow against my senses. But even he couldn't stop what was coming. The full moon called to me in ways I couldn't fight. I tightened my grip on the dagger strapped to my thigh, though we both knew steel wasn't the weapon I needed tonight. They were testing me. I could feel Marcus's scent laced through the wind, arrogant, confident, daring me to step into his snare. I should have stayed inside, but the beast under my skin itched to fight. The shadows shifted along the ridgeline, and then they emerged, leering at me, as if they waited for me to finally fall. 4 wolves, all dark and broad-shouldered, stepped into the clearing with the kind of predatory grace that came with experience. I recognized one of them, Marcus's second, Jasper, his eyes glowing faintly as his gaze settled on me. "You're far from home," I said, my voice cutting through the night. Jasper's lips curled, flashing white teeth in a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We thought we'd stop by. Enjoy the moonlight." I didn't miss the way their eyes flicked to the cabin behind me. They were waiting for Luka. "He's not here," I lied, stepping forward to block the path leading back to the cabin. "If you're here for a fight, you'll have to deal with me." Jasper's smirk widened. "That's the plan." The air shifted violently. They lunged. I barely had time to draw the dagger before the first wolf hit me, his weight slamming into my ribs and driving me backward into the snow. I twisted, driving the blade into his side, but he rolled away before I could push deeper. The second wolf was faster. I felt his claws rake across my shoulder, shredding fabric and leaving fire in their wake. I snarled, the sound more animal than human, and felt the shift pull me under like a riptide. I didn't stop it. My bones cracked, skin rippling as the infection spread through me, warping my body into something that didn't belong to either world. The world sharpened. I felt the snow beneath my paws, the cold biting into the fur that hadn't existed seconds ago. Until tonight, it was covered in glittering. Jasper hesitated for the first time. I didn't. I collided with him, knocking him to the ground, claws sinking into his chest. He snapped his teeth, but I was faster. The beast inside me wanted blood. I let it. I didn't hear Luka until it was too late. Aria? His voice sliced through the haze, but I couldn't stop. The infection roared louder, drowning him out. Jasper yelped, trying to roll free. I kept him pinned, claws biting deeper. Aria, stand down. Luka's scent hit me first, sharp, grounding. But it wasn't enough to tame the hunger clawing up from the depths. I felt his weight crash into me, knocking me sideways into the snow. I twisted mid-air, landing in his wolf form, and met me head on. I growled, circling him. His eyes met mine, gold, steady, unmoving. Come back, Luka growled softly, lowering his stance in submission. It's me. The words barely registered. I lunged. Luka dodged, but his claws caught my side, raking fire down my ribs. It wasn't a killing blow. It was meant to slow me. I staggered, but the beast didn't stop. It wanted to finish what I started. Luka met me again, his growl vibrating through the clearing. But this time, he didn't fight me. He leaned forward, baring his neck. The ultimate surrender. The sight jarred something loose. I stumbled, the weight of the shift pulling back, and in the next breath, I was human again, shivering in the cold. Luka shifted with me, snow clinging to his bare skin. He caught me before I collapsed, pulling me against his chest. You're stronger, Luka muttered, breath warm against my hair. I nodded, but I couldn't find the words. Jasper limped to his feet a few yards away, blood dripping from his muzzle. Marcus's scent bloomed at the edge of the clearing, and a heartbeat later he appeared, watching with sharp interest. Impressive, Marcus said, eyes flicking between us. I was beginning to think you weren't worth all this trouble, Aria. Luka's grip tightened around me. Marcus smiled faintly. Next moon, she'll belong to me. You know that. Luka's growl reverberated against my back. Over my dead body. Marcus tilted his head, something dangerous flickering behind his eyes. We'll see. And just like that, Marcus disappeared, his wolves following without another word. Luka didn't speak until they were gone. You should have stayed inside. His voice was low, but the strain behind it was impossible to miss. I pressed my forehead against his shoulder, trying to ignore the tremor in my limbs. I thought I could handle them. Luka exhaled sharply, brushing his lips against my hair. You can't fight this alone, Aria. Not like this. I pulled back enough to meet his gaze. I won't lose control again, I said. His eyes darkened, lingering on the fresh claw marks marring my shoulder. You already did. Luka's eyes hadn't left me, but I could feel the tension running through his body, like a wire pulled too tight. His arms stayed locked around me, as if letting go would undo the fragile control I'd clawed back. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that whatever had gripped me was gone, buried beneath the human shape I wore like armor. But I wasn't fine, and Luka knew it. His thumb brushed against the torn skin along my shoulder, the warmth of his touch seeping into the wound like he could will it to close. Come, Gale raised his eyebrow. I thought I'd lost you, Luka said, his voice hoarse. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking deep. I'm still here, I whispered, but even I wasn't sure how true that was. Luka's hand slipped beneath my knees, lifting me effortlessly. I wanted to argue, wanted to prove I could walk on my own, but the exhaustion hit me like a wave. My head rested against his chest before I could stop it. His heartbeat was steady, but his hands trembled slightly where they gripped me. I felt it more than I saw it. The silent quake in his muscles, the silent fear that hadn't faded even as the wolves disappeared into the forest. Luka wasn't scared of Marcus. He was scared of me. We didn't speak as he carried me back toward the cabin, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. The clearing faded behind us, but I couldn't shake the sensation of Marcus's eyes lingering long after he'd gone. Luka's warmth seeped into me, grounding me against the cold. But nothing could quiet the hollow ache in my chest. I'd lost control tonight. And next time, Luka might not be able to stop me. Chapter 10. The Divide Beneath the Skin. Luka wasn't in bed when I woke. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. But his side of the mattress was cold. I lay there for a moment, eyes half closed, tracing the faint imprint his body left behind. I hadn't heard him leave. I sat up slowly, rubbing the ache from my temples. My shoulder throbbed where Marcus's wolf had torn into me, but the wound had already begun knitting itself back together. Another reminder of what I was becoming. The cabin felt too still, the silence pressing against my ribs like a weight. I wrapped Luka's flannel tighter around me and stepped onto the wooden floor, following his scent out the door. The cold bit hard as I stepped outside. Moonlight bled over the clearing, but Luka wasn't there. His tracks led toward the river, heavy and deliberate. I hesitated at the tree line. He didn't want me to follow. But something in my chest twisted sharply, a warning curling deep in the pit of my stomach. I followed anyway. I found Luka near the river's edge, shirtless and barefoot, his back slick with sweat beneath the pale light. He moved in precise, brutal motions, fists snapping out, muscles flexing, as he fought against the cold with nothing but his body. His eyes flicked to me briefly, but didn't linger. "You shouldn't be out here," Luka said, his voice rougher than usual. I stepped closer, feeling the tension ripple beneath his skin like a storm barely held in check. "I woke up alone," I replied quietly. Didn't seem like you wanted company either." Luka struck out again, fists colliding with the thick trunk of a pine tree. Bark splintered beneath the force of the blow, but he didn't stop. The scent of his blood sharpened in the air. "You're hurting yourself." He ignored me, muscles coiling tighter with every swing. "Luka." He stopped mid-motion, fists trembling against the bark. His breathing came hard, shoulders rising and falling in sharp, shallow bursts. "I can't protect you if I'm weak." The words sliced through the cold, raw, and stripped bare. I stared at his back, eyes tracing the long scars that twisted down his spine, the ones I hadn't seen until Marcus forced his hand. The scars he'd never told me about. "You think this is about strength?" I stepped closer, brushing my fingers over one of the deeper scars. His body flinched beneath the touch, but didn't pull away. "Luka, you can't fight what's happening to me." His shoulders tensed. "I know. Then why are you out here beating yourself bloody? Arson?" He exhaled sharply, lowering his hands to his sides. His head dipped slightly, but I couldn't see his face. "Because I can't stop it," he said quietly. "I can't stop you." The cold wrapped around me, but it wasn't enough to drown out the steady thrum of Luka's pulse beneath my fingertips. He turned slowly, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. You scare me, Aria. The admission knocked the air from my lungs. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Luka's gaze burned into me, steady and unwavering. I've fought wars for this pack. I've faced Marcus, his wolves, and every threat that crossed my borders. But you? His voice dropped, rough with something heavier. You're the only thing that could make me lose control. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the sharp sting behind my ribs. I'm not your enemy, I said softly. Luka's hand rose, his fingers brushing the side of my jaw. His touch was light, almost hesitant, as if too much contact might break something fragile between us. You're not, he murmured. But I can feel it, Aria. When the time comes, when the time comes. My heart hammered against my chest, but I refused to look away. You think? I'll hurt you. Luka's thumb brushed over the corner of my mouth, tracing the scar Marcus's wolf had left behind. I think you'll burn everything down, trying not to. The bond between us stretched thin, pulling tight like a thread fraying at the edges. I pressed my forehead against his, closing my eyes. I won't let it take me, I whispered. Luka's breath fanned against my lips, but he didn't close the distance. His hand slipped to the back of my neck, his grip steady but unyielding. You say that now, he murmured, but what happens when Marcus pushes too hard? When the council forces my hand? I met his gaze, the weight of his fear settling deep inside my bones. I won't lose you, I said. Luka's eyes darkened. That's not your choice to make. We didn't return to the cabin right away. Luka stayed by the river, watching the moon slip lower in the sky, while I sat near the tree he'd broken apart with his fists. The distance between us had never felt wider. I could feel him retreating, one step at a time. The worst part was knowing I couldn't stop it. Luka stayed by the river long after the cold should have driven him inside. His bare shoulders glistened under the moonlight, muscles taut, his breaths slow and measured. He hadn't spoken since his confession, but his silence spoke volumes. I didn't push. Instead, I sat on the frost-dusted ground, watching him out of the corner of my eye as the night stretched thinner. Around 0600, he turned and looked out the window. I wanted to close the space between us, to pull him back before the weight of whatever haunted him dragged him under. But I couldn't chase him if he wasn't ready to be caught. And part of me wasn't sure he wanted to be. The cold seeped through Luka's flannel, but I didn't move. I needed the chill, needed to feel something other than the tension curling like smoke inside my chest. Number 36. Your mind does not have flesh. Luka thought I'd destroy everything trying to keep the infection at bay. Maybe he was right. But if I lost him now, there wouldn't be anything left to burn. By the time we returned to the cabin, the fire in the hearth had burned down to ash. Luka opened the door without a word, stepping aside to let me pass. I hesitated at the threshold, my heart thudding too loudly in the quiet. I'd imagined returning home after a fight would feel easier, the kind of ease that settled into your bones, like the warmth from a lingering fire. But the cabin felt colder now. Luka disappeared into the back room without another glance. The door closed softly behind him, leaving me alone in the dark. I leaned against the wall, pressing my palms against the rough wood, and exhaled slowly. The air around me felt heavy, laced with something unsaid, something that had been lingering for days. Luka had spent the past week training harder, running further, returning to the cabin long after the moon had risen. He never said it aloud, but I felt it every time he slipped out the door without a word. He was preparing to let me go. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And I couldn't let that happen. I pushed away from the wall, the weight in my chest solidifying into something sharp and certain. I wasn't going to lose control, not to Marcus, not to the infection, and definitely not to Luka's fear. If he didn't believe I could handle this, I'd prove him wrong. I waited until Luka's breathing deepened behind the closed door. Then I slipped out of the cabin, leaving nothing but silence in my wake. The forest stretched wide and dark ahead, the shadows breathing alongside the wind. The full moon loomed heavy above the trees, stirring something deep in my bones. I wasn't running this time. I was hunting, and I wouldn't stop until I found the strength to keep Luka and everything else I cared about from slipping away. Chapter 11: The Wolf's Temptation. Marcus's scent lingered in the forest long before I saw him. It curled beneath the trees like smoke, laced with the sharp tang of arrogance that always seemed to trail in his wake. I should have turned around. The closer I got to Marcus, the further Luka drifted. I could feel it. The way Luka pulled away every time the infection in my blood edged closer to the surface. Every time he looked at me with fear in his eyes, I felt the bond between us fray just a little more. I wasn't ready to lose him, but I couldn't wait for Luka to save me either. The clearing opened ahead, bathed in silver moonlight. Marcus stood near the center, leaning lazily against a boulder like he'd been expecting me. His eyes met mine the second I stepped into the open, and that slow, wolfish grin stretched across his face. "You're starting to make this a habit," Marcus drawled, pushing off the rock with easy grace. I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. "Don't flatter yourself. I'm here for answers, not company." Marcus's gaze flicked over me, but there was nothing soft in his expression. His wolf loomed just beneath the surface, predatory, waiting. "You're curious," Marcus said, circling me like prey. "That's dangerous for someone like you." I met his eyes head on, refusing to flinch. "You said you could help me." "I can." "Then stop playing games." Marcus's smile thinned, but he didn't stop moving. My chest tightened. Marcus watched the flicker of doubt cross my face like he could taste it. "He's afraid of you," Marcus murmured. "I see it every time he looks at you. He knows what's inside you, Aria, and he knows it'll break free eventually." I swallowed hard, heat curling beneath my skin. "That's not true, isn't it?" Marcus stopped in front of me, close enough that his breath brushed against my cheek. "You can feel it," he whispered. "The hunger, the strength. It's only a matter of time before the infection owns you completely. And when that happens," his hand brushed against my arm, light but deliberate, "you'll need someone who isn't afraid to catch you when you fall." I jerked away, ignoring the way my pulse betrayed me. "You think I'd ever trust you?" I hissed. Eustace helped me climb to my feet, my heart pounding. Marcus's eyes gleamed in the moonlight, sharp and unrelenting. "You already do," he said simply. I hated how much truth lingered in those words, but beneath the surface, beneath the arrogance and the sharp edges, there was something else. Marcus wasn't offering help out of kidness. He wanted me to break, and I wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. I took a slow step back, putting distance between us. I'm not yours to claim, I said, my voice colder than before. Marcus tilted his head slightly, but that infuriating smirk never faded. Not yet. I turned without another word, letting the forest swallow him behind me. Yeah. I didn't realize Luka had followed me until I stepped into the clearing by the river. His scent caught me first, blending with the sharp edge of pine and snow. But it wasn't the comforting presence I was used to. Luka leaned against the old oak, arms crossed, his gaze cold and unreadable as I approached. My heart twisted painfully. "How long have you been following me?" I asked quietly. Luka's eyes didn't waver. "Long enough." The space between us stretched, heavy with unspoken words. "You should have told me," Luka said, his voice rough with restrained anger. "You went to him alone." I stepped forward, but Luka didn't move. "I didn't ask you to follow." "You didn't have to." Silence fell like a stone between us, cutting sharper than claws. Luka exhaled slowly, raking a hand through his hair. "He's playing you, Aria." His eyes darkened, frustration bleeding into his words. "Marcus doesn't want to help you. He wants to control you." "I know that," I snapped, "but I can't stand by and wait for this to tear me apart, Luka. If you won't help me, I'll find someone who will." Luka's expression hardened, the muscles in his jaw flexing as he pushed off the tree. "You think I don't want to help you?" His voice lowered, rough and dangerous. "I've spent every day trying to keep you from slipping over the edge, Aria. But Marcus—" "This isn't about Marcus," I cut in. Lucas stopped. His eyes met mine, but something flickered behind them. Something that looked too much like fear. I took a slow step closer, my voice softening. "You're afraid of what I'm becoming," I said quietly, "aren't you?" Luka didn't answer right away. His hand brushed against the scar along his side, the one he got fighting Marcus's wolves, and his gaze dropped slightly. "I'm afraid of losing you," he admitted. The honesty in his voice stole the breath from my lungs. I reached for him without thinking, my fingers curling around the edge of his shirt. Luka's hand covered mine, his grip firm but hesitant. "You won't lose me," I whispered. Luka's lips hovered just above mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I already am," he murmured, and the worst part was, I felt it too. Luka's words lingered in the space between us, heavier than the cold pressing in from the forest. I tightened my grip on his shirt, grounding myself in the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath my palm. But even as I stood there, feeling the heat of his body and the weight of his gaze, I knew the divide between us hadn't closed. Luka had followed me tonight because he didn't trust me. And worse, he didn't trust himself. "I'm not leaving," I said softly, searching his face for any sign that he believed me. Luka's jaw clenched, but he didn't pull away. His hand remained over mine, his thumb brushing absently against the edge of my wrist, as if memorizing the feel of my pulse. "Do you think it's that simple?" he asked quietly. I held his gaze, refusing to let the tension unravel. "It has to be." But Luka didn't say any of those things. Instead, he brushed his fingers lightly along the side of my neck, tracing the faint scars Marcus's wolf had left behind. His eyes darkened, the gold flickering dangerously beneath the surface. "You can't fix this by running to him," Luka murmured. "Marcus isn't the answer, Aria. He never was." I swallowed hard, but the knot in my throat didn't ease. "I know that," I said quietly, "but I have to learn how to control this. If I don't—" Luka's hand dropped from my neck, his expression unreadable. "You will," he said, but there was hesitation in his voice. doubt slipping through the cracks he tried so hard to hide. I stepped back, letting the space between us widen. "You don't believe that," I murmured, more to myself than to him. Luka didn't answer. The truth lay there, raw and open. He feared the same thing I did, and that fear would eat us both alive. I found Marcus again 2 nights later. He was waiting near the river, perched on the same boulder like he hadn't moved since our last meeting. The moon hung high above the treetops, silver light pooling over the frost-bitten ground. I stepped into the clearing without hesitation, ignoring the way his eyes traced every inch of me, like he already knew why I'd come. "You're stubborn," Marcus said, pushing off the boulder with a lazy stretch. "I'll give you that." I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. "You said you could help me. Prove it." Marcus's smirk deepened, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "You don't trust Luka to handle you." I forced my expression to remain still, but the tension in my shoulders betrayed me. "Luka doesn't own me," I said, though the words felt hollow, even as they left my lips. Marcus circled slowly, moving with the kind of predatory ease I'd come to expect. "No," he agreed. "But he's already losing you. You can feel it, can't you?" I swallowed, refusing to let his words sink too deep. Marcus stopped just short of where I stood, his head tilting slightly as he studied me. "You're stronger than him, Aria. Stronger than any of them," Marcus said, his voice dropping to something softer. "Dangerous. But you'll never reach that potential if you keep letting Luka hold you back." My heart pounded loud in my ears, but I didn't step away. Marcus's hand lifted, brushing a lock of hair from my face with the kind of care that felt calculated rather than tender. "I could teach you," Marcus murmured, his voice curling around me like smoke. "You wouldn't have to fight it alone. I know what it feels like, to be caught between two worlds not quite belonging to either." I met his gaze head on, resisting the pull of his words. "I'm not you," I said, my voice firm. Marcus's lips twitched. "No," he admitted, "you're not. But you could be something greater if you let me in." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Marcus waited, his hand lingering near my jaw, eyes daring me to say yes. I thought of Luka, the quiet way he had pulled away, the fear in his voice when he told me I scared him. I thought of the scars running down his back, the price he had paid for protecting a hybrid like me once before. I thought of all the things he hadn't said, and all the things I was afraid to hear. I stepped back, putting space between Marcus and me. His hand dropped to his side, but that unreadable smirk remained. "You're wasting time," Marcus warned, his gaze hardening. "One day, Luka won't be able to save you. When that day comes, don't say I didn't offer you a way out." I forced the tremor from my voice, holding my ground. "I don't need saving." Marcus's eyes narrowed faintly, as if considering the truth behind my words. "Maybe not," Marcus said, "but you will." I left without another word, the weight of his presence trailing me long after I disappeared into the woods. I knew Marcus wouldn't stop. He'd wait, watching from the shadows, until the moment I slipped. And maybe part of me feared he was right. But when I returned to the cabin, Luka was waiting on the porch, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes burned into me, reading every unspoken word that hung between us. He didn't ask where I had been, and I didn't tell him. But I knew, as I stepped through the door and felt Luka's presence looming behind me, that the divide between us had grown just a little wider. Chapter 12. The Gathering. The full moon loomed like a predator overhead, heavy and bright against the dark stretch of sky. Its light bled over the clearing where the council gathered, pooling over the stone circle at the heart of neutral ground. I stood at the edge of the circle, my heartbeat thudding hard against my ribs. The cold bit deep, but it wasn't the winter air that made me shiver. It was the wolves watching from the shadows. Marcus stood across the clearing, his eyes fixed on me with a hunger he didn't bother masking. His pack lingered behind him, their bodies half shifted under the moon's pull, claws glinting faintly in the light. The council alphas gathered in the center, cloaked in authority and ritual. Jonas, the eldest, raised his hand to silence the murmurs weaving through the crowd. "This night is not one of blood," Jonas said, his voice steady but sharp. "We gather to witness the fate of Aria Morgan, the hybrid who stands at the heart of this conflict." The word twisted like a knife in my gut. Marcus smiled faintly, but he didn't step forward yet. He was waiting, letting the weight of the council's judgment settle over me like a snare. Luka hadn't arrived. I swallowed, eyes flicking toward the tree line, where he should have been by now. "Don't be late, Luka." Jonas turned toward me, his pale gaze cutting through the distance between us. "Step forward, Aria." I hesitated for half a breath before obeying, my boots crunching over the frozen ground. Marcus's gaze burned into me, but I kept my focus on Jonas. "As tradition dictates," Jonas continued, "on the night of the full moon, those who bear unnatural blood must either prove control or surrender to pack judgment." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You understand what's at stake?" I nodded once. "I do." Marcus's smirk widened. "Then let's begin." Jonas opened his mouth to speak the formal rites, but Marcus stepped forward, cutting him off. "I invoke the right of claim," Marcus said smoothly. The council's murmurs grew louder. Jonas's eyes narrowed. "That's not your call to make," Marcus shrugged, his focus locked on me. "Aria is without pack, without claim, and if no one steps forward, she belongs to the strongest wolf here." The words settled over the clearing like smoke. I forced myself to breathe, but the weight pressing against my chest wouldn't ease. Marcus was right. By shifter law, unclaimed hybrids fell under the authority of the strongest alpha in the room. And tonight, Luka wasn't here to stop him. Jonas's gaze flicked toward me, waiting for an objection I couldn't give. Marcus's wolf stirred beneath his skin, golden eyes burning bright. He thought he'd already won. "Do you accept the claim, Aria?" Jonas asked, though the answer hardly mattered. I opened my mouth to speak. "I do not." Luka's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. He stepped into the clearing, his eyes glowing faintly under the moonlight. His presence shifted the air, tension rippling as he crossed the circle with deliberate, predatory grace. Relief flooded me, but I kept my face still. Marcus's smirk faltered. Luka didn't stop until he stood beside me, his gaze locked on to Marcus with the weight of a challenge behind it. "She's mine," Luka said, his voice even, but carrying enough force to make Marcus's wolves shift uneasily. Marcus tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Yours? She doesn't wear your mark." Luka's muscles coiled, but he didn't move. "She will," Luka said, his voice rougher now, "before the next moon." Before the next moon. A ripple passed through the crowd. The weight of Luka's words sank deep into the clearing. I could feel the shift in the pack dynamic, the sudden, unmistakable declaration Luka had made not just to Marcus, but to everyone. Mate. Marcus's smile faded entirely. His wolf bristled beneath his skin, but he didn't step forward. Not yet. Jonas nodded once, acknowledging Luka's challenge. Very well, Jonas said. Aria's fate is no longer up for claim. His gaze shifted to Marcus. Unless you intend to challenge Luka directly. The air grew sharper, colder. Marcus's wolf flickered in his eyes, but he stepped back, lips curling into something darker than a smile. Not tonight, Marcus said, his gaze lingering on me longer than necessary. But the moon will rise again. I held his stare, refusing to blink first. It always does, I replied. Marcus's wolf growled low in his throat, but he didn't push further. Jonas dismissed the gathering with a sharp motion, and the wolves began to disperse, their eyes flicking toward Luka and me with open curiosity and speculation. Luka didn't say a word until Marcus had disappeared into the trees. Only then did he exhale slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly. You cut it close, I said, my voice quieter now that the crowd had faded. Luka turned toward me, his expression unreadable. I wasn't going to let him take you. I searched his face, looking for the hesitation that had lingered between us for days. But it wasn't there. Not tonight. You declared a bond, I said softly. Luka's hand brushed against mine, his fingers curling lightly around my wrist. It wasn't a declaration, Luka murmured. His eyes met mine, steady and unrelenting. It was the truth. Luka's words hung in the air, heavier than the weight of Marcus's stare. It wasn't a declaration. It was the truth. His hand lingered against mine, the roughness of his palm grounding me as the moon watched overhead. I wanted to believe the tension between us had shifted, softened under the weight of his confession. But Marcus wasn't the type to let things slip away so easily. He stood at the far edge of the clearing, half hidden beneath the shadows of the trees. The council had begun to disperse, their attention drawn elsewhere, but Marcus hadn't moved. He was waiting, watching. Luka's grip tightened slightly. He felt it too. Jonas paused near Marcus, exchanging a few quiet words I couldn't hear. Whatever he said didn't sit well. Marcus's smirk faded, his wolf flickering sharp beneath his skin. Finally, Marcus stepped into the open once more, his footsteps slow but deliberate as he crossed the clearing. His pack didn't follow. I felt Luka tense beside me, the shift humming dangerously beneath his skin. Marcus stopped a few paces away, his eyes fixed on Luka. You think this changes anything? Marcus's voice was quiet, but the threat laced beneath it cut through the cold. Luka didn't respond immediately. He shifted his stance, placing himself directly between Marcus and me, his broad frame blocking the path entirely. It changes everything, Luka said calmly. Marcus chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. You can't protect her forever. His gaze flicked toward me, sharp and lingering. Eventually, she'll break, and when she does, Luka's growl cut him off, low and dangerous. You won't be the one to catch her, Luka snapped. Marcus's smile returned, slow and deliberate. Won't I? Marcus's eyes burned gold beneath the moonlight. You forget what she is, Luka. Hybrids don't stay tethered long. They slip away. It's in their nature. Luka took a step forward, his energy crackling around him like a storm ready to break. She's not your concern, Luka said. Marcus's smirk didn't waver. She will be. Jonas's voice rose behind them, sharp and cutting. Enough. The tension in the clearing stretched thin, but Luka didn't look away from Marcus. Jonas crossed the stone circle, his gaze hard. This isn't the place for a fight. Marcus tilted his head, but he didn't argue. No, Marcus agreed. It's not. Luka's wolf bristled, muscles flexing beneath his skin. I could feel the restraint simmering just beneath the surface. The careful control Luka barely held on to. Marcus felt it too. We settled this at the next full moon, Marcus said, his eyes locking onto Luka's. One way or another. Luka's jaw tightened, but he gave a single nod. Agreed. Marcus lingered for a breath longer, his eyes flicking toward me one last time before he stepped back, melting into the shadows. His wolves followed, their silent retreat disappearing into the forest, the only humans inside swallowing their sorrow in silence. Luka stayed still, his breathing slow and measured, but I felt the weight pressing into him long after Marcus was gone. The council dispersed quietly, leaving Luka and me alone beneath the moon. I reached for his hand, curling my fingers lightly around his. You didn't have to challenge him, I said softly. Luka's eyes met mine, and something deep and unrelenting. Yes, Luka murmured. I did. His thumb brushed absently over the edge of my knuckles, grounding both of us. This won't end the way Marcus thinks, Luka said, his voice lower now. I won't let him take you, Aria, no matter what it costs me. His words should have reassured me, but all I felt was the sharp edge of dread curling beneath my ribs. Because I knew Marcus, and Marcus didn't fight fair. Chapter 13, The Wolf's Reckoning. The full moon hung low, heavy and swollen with the weight of what was about to happen. Luka's body thrummed beside me, his energy coiling tighter with every step toward the clearing. His muscles flexed beneath the thin cotton of his shirt, his eyes already flickering gold in the moonlight. Tonight, this would end. Marcus was waiting. I felt his presence long before I saw him, his scent curling through the forest like a brand, staking his claim on ground that wasn't his. His wolves stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes glowing faintly, hunger pressing against the boundary that separated them from us. Luka stopped just shy of the circle's edge. I felt the tension in him, the barely leashed violence simmering under his skin. His wolf wanted out, wanted to rip Marcus apart beneath the moon, and for once, I wasn't going to stop him. Jonas stood in the center of the clearing, his gaze moving between Luka and Marcus, like he already knew this wouldn't end without blood. Step forward, Jonas called, his voice echoing through the quiet woods. Luka didn't hesitate. Marcus followed, his grin lazy, as if this was nothing more than a game he already knew he'd win. His gaze lingered on me for half a breath too long, and I felt the shift ripple beneath my skin in response. He wanted to provoke me. Luka caught it too. His growl was low, vibrating through the bond we shared. Jonas raised a hand to silence them both. We settled this by the old ways, Jonas said, his eyes narrowing. The council will not intervene. This is a matter of dominance and right. Marcus's smile widened, but Luka's gaze never wavered. Do you both accept the challenge? Jonas asked. Luka's eyes locked onto Marcus. I do. Marcus's gaze flicked toward me, lingering just long enough to make my stomach twist. I do, he said, voice smooth. Jonas stepped back, leaving the clearing to them. The second he moved, Marcus lunged. The shift tore through Luka in a heartbeat. One moment he was human. The next his wolf stood where he had been, fur bristling, claws slicing into the frozen ground. Marcus met him mid-air, their bodies colliding with the force of a thunderclap. I stood at the edge of the clearing, my breath caught in my throat as they fought. This wasn't dominance posturing. This was survival. Luka's wolf was larger, stronger, but Marcus was fast. He ducked beneath Luka's swipes, sinking his teeth into Luka's shoulder. Luka twisted violently, throwing Marcus aside with a snarl that rattled the trees. Blood stained the snow. Marcus rolled to his feet, already shifting back to human form, his lips curling in a smirk even as his chest heaved. "You can't stop this," Marcus said, his voice ragged but steady. "She'll break. You'll see it soon enough." You turn around and slowly, whispering to Margaret with each. Luka didn't shift back. His wolf circled, muscles rippling beneath his fur, eyes locked onto Marcus with a feral intensity I'd never seen before. Marcus lunged again, faster this time. Luka met him, their bodies crashing together in a whirlwind of claws and teeth, but I felt it the moment Luka faltered. Marcus's teeth found his side, ripping deep enough to make Luka stagger. I didn't think. The shift hit me hard, dragging me under in an instant. My bones cracked, muscles stretching, fur rippling along my arms as the infection inside me surged to the surface. The barely visible blood below screamed and hurt. Then came my sorrowful laughter when I felt better. I collided with Marcus before Luka hit the ground. The force of the impact sent Marcus sprawling. I followed, my wolf pressing down on him, teeth bared at his throat. I felt the power surge beneath my skin, raw and untamed. Kill him. The thought wasn't mine. It was something deeper, something primal, urging me to finish what Luka couldn't. Marcus's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker behind them. I sank my teeth into his shoulder, and he howled beneath me, clawing at the earth. "Aria!" Luka's voice rang through the clearing. "Hi!" His wolf staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his flank. I froze, Marcus pinned beneath me, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. I could end this, right now. But Luka's eyes, fierce and steady, held mine. I let Marcus go. He scrambled back, shifting as he retreated, his wolves gathering blood from his mouth. Luka shifted back, bare-chested and bloodied, but unbroken. "No," Luka said, his voice calm but final. "It is." Marcus held his gaze for a long moment before disappearing into the woods, his wolves following without another word. Luka swayed on his feet, exhaustion rolling off him in waves. I shifted back, breathless, barely catching him as he stumbled forward. "You're bleeding," I said, panic creeping into my voice. Luka grunted, leaning into me. "I'm fine, it's nothing." I pressed my forehead against his, my heart hammering too hard in my chest. "You saved me." I closed my eyes, feeling the bond between us hum, steady, and strong beneath the moon. For the first time in weeks, I felt whole. Luka leaned into me, his weight solid but steady, as I helped him toward the edge of the clearing. His breath was warm against my temple, but his body trembled from the blood loss. Jonas stepped forward, his expression hard as the last traces of Marcus's wolves vanished into the woods. "The council has seen enough," Jonas said, his voice even but sharp. His gaze flicked to Luka's wounds, then to me. Still bare beneath the full moon's light, bruises and scrapes from the fight scattered across my skin. I pulled Luka closer, feeling the low thrum of his heartbeat against my side. "You both defied our laws tonight," Jonas continued, his tone edged with finality. Marcus's claim was not invalid, no matter how much we disapprove of his method. Luka's grip tightened around my waist. He tried to take her by force. Luka growled, voice rough and low. You saw it. Jonas met his gaze without flinching. I did. And by challenging him outside of the rites, you sealed your fate. A heavy silence pressed down over the clearing. I felt the weight of every council member's stare, judgment curling like frost in the cold night air. Luka straightened, pulling away from me enough to stand on his own, blood still dripping from the wound at his ribs. Say what you came to say, Jonas, Luka said. Jonas's expression didn't shift. You are both exiled, Jonas said quietly, his voice carrying like a gavel strike. I stiffened, but Luka's arm wrapped around me again, grounding me. You can't, I started, but Luka squeezed my hand. We knew this was coming, Luka murmured, his breath fanning against my hair. It doesn't matter. Jonas's gaze softened, just barely. But the finality of his words didn't fade. You are no longer welcome on neutral ground, Jonas said, addressing the gathered wolves. Luka's territory is forfeit. Marcus will assume control. I felt Luka tense, his wolf bristling beneath his skin, but he held it back. Jonas stepped closer, lowering his voice. You fought for her, and I understand why, but the council cannot protect you from Marcus's retaliation. The only path left is exile. Luka's eyes met his. I don't need protection. Jonas studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. No, Jonas said. I don't suppose you do. The council began to disperse, leaving Luka and me alone beneath the moon, the clearing quiet except for the rustle of leaves in the wind. I exhaled slowly, watching Jonas disappear between the trees. Luka's hand trailed down my arm, his fingers brushing over the bruises Marcus had left. You're quiet, Luka said softly. I lifted my gaze, searching his face. The exhaustion lingered there, but his eyes were calm, steady, like a weight he'd carried for too long had finally been lifted. I don't care about the council, I said, but I care about you. Luka's thumb brushed over the edge of my jaw, his touch warm despite the cold pressing in from the forest. I told you, Luka murmured. This doesn't change anything. I leaned into him, feeling the bond between us thrum steady and unbroken beneath my skin. We don't have to stay here, Luka said, his lips brushing lightly against my temple. We can start over somewhere else, somewhere Marcus can't reach. I nodded, feeling the sharp edge of hope rising in my chest. Wherever you go, I whispered, I'll follow. Luka's arm tightened around me, and for the first time in weeks, the weight of Marcus's shadow felt distant, like the cold that lingered only at the edges of the fire's light. Then we leave tonight, Luka said softly, and as we walked side by side into the dark, the moon following overhead, I knew we were stronger now. Together. Chapter 14. Beneath the Skin. The forest felt different now. No more territory lines marked the trees. No invisible borders separated Luka and me from the rest of the pack. The air no longer carried the weight of the council's judgment or Marcus's threats. But there was something else. An emptiness, stretched thin like the air right before a storm. Luka hadn't spoken much since we left the clearing behind. His arm slung over my shoulders as we walked deeper into the woods. His breathing was slow, steady, but the tension that radiated from him said everything his words hadn't. I didn't push. I let the silence settle, curling around us like a second skin. It wasn't until we crossed the river, miles from the clearing, that Luka finally eased his weight off me. He stepped forward, bare feet pressing into the cold, mossy ground. I watched him quietly. The moonlight cut across his skin, illuminating the bruises that marred his ribs and the faint sheen of sweat that clung to him. "You're brooding again," he muttered. I didn't move. I smiled into the twinkle in his eye. "I don't brood," I shot back. His lips twitched. "You do when you're thinking too hard." I crossed my arms, leaning against a fallen log. "Can you blame me?" Luka's gaze flicked toward the sky, watching the clouds shift lazily across the stars. The wolf in him hadn't settled yet. I could feel it. A low hum beneath his skin, waiting. He hadn't fully shifted since the fight with Marcus. I wasn't sure if that was by choice or necessity. "Are you regretting it?" I asked, my voice softer than before. Luka's eyes slid back to me, gold flickering faintly behind the dark. "Regretting what?" "Challenging Marcus, leaving the pack, all of it." Luka exhaled slowly, his hands braced against his hips, as if he was weighing the question. Finally, he shook his head. "No," he said simply. I knew what I was doing. I searched his face for any sign of hesitation. But Luka's expression remained calm, anchored in the quiet certainty I had come to trust. And yet, something still lingered beneath the surface. "Then why does it feel like you're holding back?" I asked quietly. Luka's gaze sharpened, locking onto mine with the kind of intensity that had always unnerved me. "I'm not holding back," he said, stepping closer. The space between us crackled, tension humming in the cool night air. I didn't move, neither did he. Luka's hand rose, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. His fingers lingered against my cheek, rough and warm, grounding me even as his eyes darkened. "You're still afraid," I whispered. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, pausing just beneath my chin. "Not of you," Luka murmured, his voice low, "of what I might become when I'm with you." The bond between us tightened, pulling like a thread stretched too thin. I felt it curl around my ribs, sinking into the parts of me that Luka had already claimed. "I don't want you to hold back," I said, my voice barely audible. Luka's breath hitched. His hand slipped to the back of my neck, fingers tangling in my hair as he pulled me forward. His lips met mine with quiet intensity. Not desperate, but deliberate. I melted into him, the forest fading until there was nothing but the warmth of his mouth and the solid weight of his body pressing against mine. His other arm wrapped around my waist, dragging me closer, as if he was afraid I'd slip away if he let go. But I wasn't going anywhere. Ah, the bond pulsed stronger between us, hot and electric, until I could feel his heartbeat against mine. Luka's kiss deepened, and for the first time in weeks, the wolf inside me didn't fight him. She curled beneath the surface, content. I pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, breathing hard. Luka's forehead pressed against mine, his eyes half-lidded and glowing faintly gold. "You're mine," he whispered, more to himself than to me. I brushed my thumb over the scar along his collarbone, the mark Marcus's wolf had left. "And you're mine," I replied softly. Luka's arms tightened around me, but this time there was no hesitation. We stood there beneath the full moon, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time I felt the weight of exile lift. We didn't belong to each other, and that was enough. The forest cradled us in silence. Luka's breathing slowed, his forehead still pressed against mine, but I felt the steady thrum of his pulse beneath my fingertips. The bond between us held, stronger now, woven tight by everything we had endured, but the weight of the future lingered in the space around us, pressing in like the cold that refused to fade. Luka's hand skimmed down my back, grounding me as the last traces of tension bled from his body. For once, his wolf felt calm, resting beneath the surface instead of clawing to take control. I shifted slightly, brushing a lock of hair from his eyes. "What now?" I asked softly, breaking the fragile quiet between us. Luka's gaze flicked toward the distant tree line, the faintest flicker of gold still lingering in his eyes. "We keep moving. Marcus won't let this go." I swallowed hard. The mention of Marcus dragging reality back into focus. "He'll come for us," I said. It wasn't a question. Luka nodded, his jaw tightening. "Eventually, but I won't let him touch you, Aria." His voice dipped lower, rough with the promise that simmered beneath the words. "Not again." I rested my palm against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath my hand. "We can't run forever." Luka's eyes softened slightly, his fingers curling around mine. "We're not running. We're choosing to survive on our terms." His words settled into the space between us. Quiet, but certain. I believed him. But I also knew Marcus. He wouldn't stop, not until he tore apart everything Luka and I had built, and I wasn't going to let him. Luka must have sensed the shift in my mood. His thumb traced slow, deliberate circles along my palm, his grip steady. "Whatever happens next," Luka murmured, his voice low against my ear, "we face it together." I leaned into him, letting the warmth of his breath chase away the cold. "Together," I echoed. By the time we reached the cabin, one Luka had taken us to deep in the mountains, far from Marcus's territory, the sky had begun to lighten. The first traces of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the forest in muted shades of blue and gray. Luka stepped inside first, scanning the interior with the sharpness of someone who hadn't yet let their guard down. I followed, closing the door behind me with a soft thud. The cabin was small, tucked away beneath a canopy of fir trees, but it felt safe. A fireplace set cold in the corner, the stone mantel covered in a thin layer of dust. Luka dropped his pack by the door, rubbing his shoulder absently. His wounds from the fight had begun to heal, but I didn't miss the stiffness in his movements. "You need rest," I said, stepping closer. Luka's lips twitched faintly. "So do you." I placed my hands against his chest, gently guiding him backward, until the edge of the couch pressed into his legs. Luka resisted for half a heartbeat before he let himself sink down, pulling me with him. The weight of his arms wrapped around me, solid and familiar as I rested against his. For a while neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the flames licking higher as Luka stoked it with one hand. I traced idle patterns along the scars that marked his forearms, each one telling a story I already knew by heart. "This feels strange," I admitted quietly. Luka arched a brow. "Being alone?" I nodded. "No pack, no borders, just us." His hand tightened around mine. "Strange doesn't mean bad, Aria." I met his gaze, finding the steadiness I'd come to rely on. "No," I agreed, "it doesn't." Luka pressed a kiss to my temple, his touch soft but lingering. "We'll build something new." Chapter 15. The Rising Shadow. Abyss of light against darkness. The fire crackled low in the hearth, the flames casting restless shadows across the cabin walls. Luka's arm rested along the back of the couch, his fingers tracing idle patterns against my shoulder. The weight of his body beside mine grounded me, his steady breathing matching the slow rhythm of the flickering light. But even with Luka's warmth anchoring me, the uneasy quiet that had settled over the cabin wouldn't leave. I felt it hours before the knock came, like a whisper along my skin, an itch I couldn't scratch. Something was coming, and it wasn't Marcus. Luka shifted beside me, his hand stilling just before the sound echoed through the cabin. 3 solid knocks. No hesitation. Luka's gaze slid to mine, gold flickering faintly in the dim light. "We weren't followed," he said quietly. "I know," I replied, already rising to my feet. Luka's muscles tensed as he stood, his bare feet silent against the floor. His wolf rode just beneath the surface, though he hadn't shifted fully since the fight with Marcus. I opened the door, letting the cold night air spill into the cabin. A man stood at the threshold, his breath fogging faintly in the moonlight. His hair was streaked with silver, though he didn't look old. Weathered, maybe, but strong. His dark eyes settled on me first, then flicked past my shoulder to Luka. "Luka," the man said, his voice low and rough, like gravel beneath boot heels. Luka stepped forward, blocking the doorway slightly. "Elias." Luka's tone was unreadable. "You're far from home." Elias crossed his arms, leaning against the wooden frame. "I heard about the council's decision. Exile's a heavy price." Luka's jaw flexed, but he didn't reply. I watched Elias carefully. His scent was different from Luka's pack, earthier, with the faintest trace of something ancient lingering beneath it. Not one of Marcus's, but not an ally either. "I didn't come to gloat," Elias added, glancing between us. "I came to warn you." Luka's posture stiffened. Elias exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the tree line. "Marcus was the least of your problems. There's another alpha rising, and he's not like the others." I stepped closer, crossing my arms to mirror Elias's stance. "Who?" Elias's eyes locked onto mine, something dark lingering behind them. "His name is Cade," Elias said. "He doesn't play by pack rules, doesn't care for council judgment. He's building something dangerous. And he's looking for wolves like you." I felt Luka's energy shift beside me, the temperature in the cabin dropping slightly. "Hybrids," Luka said, the word curling like a threat. Elias nodded. "Not just hybrids. Rogues. Outcasts. Anyone strong enough to survive his ranks. He's forming his own pack. Outside council control." Luka's hand brushed against the small of my back, a subtle but protective gesture. I frowned, searching Elias's expression for something more. "And why are you telling us this?" he asked. Elias's lips twitched faintly, but there was no humor in it. "Because Marcus wasn't the last wolf who had his eye on you," Elias said, his gaze lingering on me for a beat longer than necessary. "Cade's heard the stories about what you did. He's coming, Aria, whether you're ready or not." The cold wrapped tighter around me, sinking into the spaces Luka's warmth couldn't reach. I didn't flinch. "Let him," I said quietly. Elias studied me for a long moment, then pushed away from the doorframe, stepping back into the night. "I'll be nearby," Elias added, his tone softer now. "If you need me." Luka's eyes narrowed faintly, but he didn't stop Elias as he disappeared into the shadows. When the door closed, silence stretched between Luka and me, the weight of Elias's warning hanging heavy in the air. Luka's arm slid around my waist, pulling me back against his chest. His breath brushed against the side of my neck, warm despite the chill that still clung to my skin. "I should have killed Marcus when I had the chance," Luka muttered, his voice low and rough. I tilted my head, resting it against his. "Marcus isn't the threat anymore." Luka's grip tightened slightly, his thumb brushing against the curve of my hip. "No," he agreed quietly, "but Cade will be." I exhaled, letting my eyes slip shut for a moment, feeling the steady pulse of Luka's heartbeat beneath my palm. Cade's name settled into the back of my mind like an echo. lingering even as Luka's arms tightened around me. The fight with Marcus had felt final, like the breaking point I'd spent so long dreading. But now, standing beneath the weight of the full moon, I realized something else. Marcus was just the beginning. And whatever lay ahead, it would be far worse. Amanda Hartwell's. Luka's breathing slowed, his arms steady around me, but I felt the tension lingering in his frame. He hadn't let go of the fight. Not really. I turned in his hold, resting my hands against his chest. You're thinking too hard. His lips twitched faintly, but there was no humor behind it. I have good reason. I brushed my thumb along the edge of the scar Marcus left. We'll handle Cade the same way we handled Marcus. Luka's gaze dipped to mine, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. You shouldn't have to keep fighting, Aria. Not like this. I'm not afraid of him, I replied, though the words felt heavier than I intended. Luka tilted his head, brushing his lips against my forehead. You should be. I exhaled, leaning into him, letting the bond beneath my skin. Maybe I should have been afraid, but something in me, the part Marcus couldn't break, refused to bow. Later that night, long after Luka had fallen asleep, I slipped outside. The cold bit deep, but I barely felt it. I stood at the edge of the tree line, watching the shadows ripple beneath the moon. Cade's name echoed in my mind. I didn't know who he was, what kind of alpha he claimed to be, but I knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't get the chance to tear apart the life Luka and I were building. Not now, not ever. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest trace of a new scent, something foreign and sharp that disappeared almost as soon as it arrived. I lingered, listening to the forest breathe. Cade was out there, and this wasn't over. It was just the beginning.